Thank you very much, participants to this side event. And we'd like to start this side event for today. I wish to welcome you all. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I understand we have many time zones and people are connected from different parts of the world. It's currently 19:30 in Japan, Tokyo, where we are right now. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this official side event on healthy soils for food security in Africa and looking at the potential of regenerative agriculture, which is a very important topic in the world today when it comes to agriculture productivity. This event is hosted by the Sasakawa Africa Association and the Japan International Research Center for Agriculture Sciences. My name is Melo Loch, and I'm the Strategic Partnership Director with Sasakawa Africa Association, and I will be guiding this event for today. And it's very nice to see you all here. Just a few quick housekeeping points before you get started. There is Japanese English simultaneous translation, which is available. You see the icon below, so you can choose which language you're comfortable with. And during the event, we'll cover as many questions as possible from some which have been submitted during the registration. And we'll also receive additional questions which will be submitted during this Zoom chat. And we'll answer as many of them as time permits in the question and answer session towards the end of the event. And those questions we will not be able to address, probably due to lack of time. We plan to gather those answers from the speakers and publish them in the website at a later date. Now I'd like to open our side event by starting with the welcoming remarks from Professor Ruth Onyango, who is the chair of the board of Sasakawa Africa Association and the founder of the African Journal for Agriculture, Food, Nutrition and Development, and also the 2017 Africa Food Prize laureate. Please welcome Professor Ruth Onyango. You are very much welcome to give your welcome remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you so much for welcoming me to this event. But more so, let's thank all those who have worked so hard, especially behind the scenes, to make this possible. You realize that this is our first TICAD side event to be held online by Zoom. So much has happened, so many people are challenged, but I just want to thank everybody who has been able to make it to this event, and also to just say how happy we are to be hosting this with our partner JIRCAS. And let's also thank our distinguished guests who have been able to make it. And this promises to be a very, very exciting event. I've seen the lineup of the distinguished guests, including award-winning Dr. Lal, and then we have Dr. Gila and everybody I've just seen here. I think it's going to be very, very exciting. And as partners who have hosted this, I think we are very happy. I'm just representing the board here. And also let me bring greetings from Mr. Sasakawa Yohei, the chairman of the Nippon Foundation. And ordinarily, clearly, he will be here. So we bring his greetings. And we've come a long way as an organization, starting way back in 1986, as a response to a devastating famine that hit the Horn of Africa. And as you are aware right now, the Horn of Africa is now experiencing the worst drought ever. I think it will be worse than what we experienced in 1986. And yet we are still talking about food security. And yet we are still facing these problems here. So it's an enormous challenge right now. And there's just so much hunger around. And those of us who work with smallholder farmers, not the challenges they face. But you know, as Sasakawa Africa Association, we've tried very hard ever since we were created to, you know, to apply simple, promote simple, cost-effective technologies small packages which smallholder farmers can afford in Africa. That is like improved varieties of seeds and crops, chemical fertilizer usage at that time, along with field demonstrations right at the farmer level, and also having farmers learn from each other, and also being sensitive of gender inclusiveness in what we do. That has been what we have been doing. And we really mostly concentrated on improving productivity. But then now, as time has gone on, we still have hunger. But at the same time, we are now faced with making sure that the food we eat is diverse. We now worry about nutrition. We worry about other issues as well, the safety of the food we eat. We worry about post-harvest issues. We have to address that. How can we also make money out of farming as land sizes become smaller and smaller? And agro-processing. So we have now concentrated on the value chain. And then with the conferences which have gone on, including what was hosted by the UN, food systems, we find ourselves in that space. Something else that has happened is that we now have partners. For example, this event now, we are hosting with JIRCAS, and we have other partners on other programs, and it actually makes a lot of sense because the goal is the same. We are trying to improve food security for Africa. Not easy, but we have to do so. We have to keep working at this as we face these challenges. Now, all of us have experienced a challenge of Corona. There's no doubt, that maybe most of us who are here have had a brush with Corona, maybe even more than one time. And if you have and you are still alive, let's just thank God and let's pray that we keep alive. And it's like it's become now a common cold, but as far as I'm concerned, it's just now too common. So those are challenges of climate variability. Farmers don't know what to do. When do you plant? After you harvest, rains are coming. How do you dry your crop? And so we are faced with this in this space we work in, but we can't give up. We just have to continue doing this. So the partnerships, as far as I'm concerned, are really very good. They have worked for us. And in our strategic plan, which we have since 2021, regenerative agriculture came up. We have enhanced our gender inclusiveness. We have enhanced nutrition, diversity in what we do. And we actually are now more or less global in terms of partnerships. And we'll continue to work with the national governments because they are the ones actually who do the extension. They have the personnel. They know what their people want. And so when we partner with the governments, it makes our work much, much easier, something we have not run away from. And also we follow the policies of the government. So we're just partners, supportive as much as we can. And the governments also have challenges, limited resources there. And we are lucky as an organization that we have had the Nippon Foundation right from the word go in 1986, supporting us. And we continue to work with them, but at the same time as we work with other partners as well. Yeah, so in that sense, we're extremely happy that today we're organizing this very important event with JIRCAS. Last time we had in 2018, we had TICAD. It was in Yokohama, Japan. We learned a lot from there, some of which we're actually applying in Africa right now. So regenerative agriculture now is a fairly new concept. We are applying it and we want to do research on it so that we continue to make sure that, that we understand exactly what its benefits are and what the challenges are. But we are going to learn a lot more from the amazing experts we have now in this session who are going to present, and I hope you can also have questions to ask and that all of us can stay with the Q&A. So Mel, thank you so much for this. And I just want to say to everybody, thank you so much and welcome and enjoy yourselves. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor Ruth, and for those welcoming remarks and for those important insights. Now I'd like to welcome Mr. Osamu Koyama, who is the president of the Japan International Research Center for Agriculture Sciences, which is JIRCAS. So, Mr. Koyama, please, your welcome remarks.
Thank you, Mel. Distinguished participants and distinguished speakers, a pleasant day to all of you who are joining us today from different time zones. As president of Japan International Research Center for Agricultural Sciences, JIRCAS, one of the national research and development agencies in Japan, it's a great honor and privilege to co-host this TICAD8 online side event together with the Sasakawa Africa Association. Healthy soil is fundamental to providing healthy and nutritious food, and it is especially true for Africa. While African region needs to boost its food production to nourish the growing population and to transform its agriculture for economic development, its land has long suffered from soil degradation and increasingly been subject to climate change stresses. There is thus the urgent need for innovations, not only to mitigate soil degradation, but also to revitalize and improve the functioning of soil ecosystem for productivity and sustainability. At the same time, given the extreme heterogeneity of African small-scale agriculture, there's no silver bullet technical solution. So with these challenges ahead, the partnership among government, development, research, and extension sectors is essential in order to achieve social scale impacts. JIRCAS has long committed itself to soil-related studies to address soil health, food security, and environmental sustainability in Africa through international multidisciplinary collaborative research. Especially, we have had comparative advantage in empirical approach to develop fine-scale soil fertility management technologies, addressing physical and chemical characteristics of soil by utilizing both advanced tools and locally available resources. With this technical expertise, JIRCAS could contribute to the realization of regenerative development outcomes through effective collaboration with partners, including the Sasakawa Africa Association, as well as the academic research and government organizations participating in today's event. I sincerely hope that this side event on the occasion of TICAD8 will provide a forum for research and development communities to collaborate more closely and to promote innovations that will eventually realize truly regenerative soil management for food and nutrition security, which can then contribute to improving livelihood opportunity for farmers and stimulating broad-based agricultural development for African continent. Thank you very much. Please enjoy the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koyama, for those insightful comments on your welcome remarks, and we really appreciate taking your time to be with us here today. That is highly appreciated. We'd like to take this opportunity now to move to the keynote address, where we'll have two very important, distinguished scientists who will give two keynote addresses this morning. And we would like to start with Professor Ratan Lal. Professor Lal is a distinguished university professor of soil science at Ohio State University in the US. and a 2020 World Food Prize laureate on developing and mainstreaming a soil-centric approach to increasing food production that restores and conserves natural resources and mitigate climate change. He has many incredible achievements and awards which we cannot mention due to lack of time, but you could look up that in our website to see all these incredible achievements. So Professor Latan, please, the opportunity is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the organizers, Dr. Amit Roy and colleagues. I'd like to thank Professor Ruth, Professor Kayama for the opportunity. I'd like to begin by stating that the world at the present is in the grip of 3 C's. And those 3 stand for COVID, climate change, and conflict. And all those 3 C's have aggravated food and nutritional insecurity and aggravated human misery and sufferings. However, the bright side is that Africa does have natural resources. Africa does have excellent research expertise, human power, and Africa can be, should be, will be breadbasket of the world. It will be African savanna miracle that we will witness, and I'm sure about it, just as we have witnessed the Cerrado miracle. And this African savanna miracle will require 4 steps to achieve the food self-sufficiency as well as export capability. Number 1, translating science into action. Implementing policies which are pro-farmer, pro-nature, and pro-agriculture. Enhancing respectability of the farming profession and involving private sector. With political willpower to translate science into action by empowering farmers through pro-farming practices, Africa indeed can be breadbasket of the world. Let's think about Africa spending $65 billion in the late 2020s for importing food. And this money could have been invested in promoting science-based agriculture to produce food locally. Therefore, with adoption of improved agriculture, such as that proposed under AGRA, CASH, ICA, many other SAA, JIRCAS, Africa will be and should be food self-sufficient. There are some challenges. And one of the most important challenges is the population. The African population, which now stands at 1.4 billion, is projected to be 4.2 billion by 2100. However, there are 3 generations between now and 2100. And there is a scope for reversing the trend or decreasing the rate of increase by, and I want to strengthen this point, empowering women through education and making them self-reliant so that they have control on their own destiny. The rate of population can be reduced. In fact, there are examples that rather than 4.2 billion, it might be stabilized perhaps at 3 billion with that. Now, Africa also has not only total population, African population is also increasing in terms of the urban part, and many urban cities such as Accra between 1975 and 2050 probably gone up by a factor of 7, Addis Ababa by another 7, Dar es Salaam by a factor of 10, Kinshasa by 11. That means urbanization has to be planned. The urban centers have to be planned in such a way that about 25 to 30% of the fresh produce comes from within the city limits. The slogan should be one home, one garden. One home, one garden. Even if you live in a flat, having communal gardens is a great policy, is a great idea to address food security issue that Africa is facing. The other challenges which need to be addressed include, of course, the drought of the 70s, drought of 80s, and Professor Ruth mentioned serious drought in the Horn of Africa at present, and soil degradation that aggravates the drought. And soil degradation means including depletion of soil organic matter content, salinization, the problems of high soil temperature, climate change that increases the drought, soil temperature, which is normally not addressed. In sub-Saharan Africa, especially the Sahelian region, I have monitored my own research experiment there from 1969 to 87, temperature of the surface 1 centimeter layer reaching 52 degrees Celsius. Yet, when you mulch it with a cover crop or with a crop residue, the temperature can be decreased by 20 degrees centigrade to about 30 to 35. And that is a method of managing the soil temperature. I must say something about the irrigation problem and the drought. Irrigation can be really very, very effective, and only 6% of irrigable land area in Africa is being irrigated, hardly 13 million hectares. Compare that with 14% in Latin America and 40%, 40, in Asia. Therefore, improving irrigation, managing water resources properly, and alleviating drought by mulch farming, conservation agriculture, promoting drip sub-irrigation, not furrow irrigation, not flood irrigation, not sprinkler irrigation, drip sub-fertigation in combination with conservation agriculture. And the drip irrigation can be powered by solar panels. And at the same time, improving soil organic matter content. Drought is a soil management issue. Think of Israel. Israel practically has no rainfall, yet they manage whatever water they have in such a way that they are feeding the vegetable fruits to the entire Europe. And I think drought is something which involves more judicious, prudent management of natural resources. Then comes the question of nutrition, plant nutrition. The global fertilizer use at present is 135 kilogram per hectare, 135 kilogram per hectare. China, 400 kilogram per hectare. India, 200 kilogram per hectare. Punjab province of India, 250 kilogram per hectare. The rate of fertilizer used in sub-Saharan Africa as of today is 17 kilogram per hectare. There is no justification. I know fertilizer availability from Ukraine has been disrupted, but the natural resources for fertilizer production and supply to the world exist within Africa, and we must develop them. Sub-Saharan Africa is 20% of the world's arable land, 20% of the world arable land, but it consumes only 2% of the world's fertilizer. This must be addressed. It has to be addressed. And that address has to be based on a green revolution strategy, which is soil-centric. The person who introduced me mentioned the idea of soil-centric approach. Varieties are important, absolutely important, no question, but the improved varieties cannot do the miracle until the nutrients and water are available in the root zone. We have to provide them. And therefore, the green revolution in Africa, which has been bypassed, it has happened everywhere else in Asia, Central America, and elsewhere else, but not in Africa, because soil have been neglected. Therefore, our philosophy has to be green revolution, which is based on soil resilience, on eco-efficiency, improving the efficiency of inputs. And it has to be science-based. Yes, I agree, soil fertility must be improved. But soil fertility dumping fertilizer alone without restoring soil physical and biological properties cannot work. Therefore, the idea is the overall soil health must be restored. Soil organic carbon content and stock must be improved to the optimal range. Carbon content of about 1.5 to 2% in the root zone. When it is merely 0.2%, 0.25%. Therefore, dumping fertilizer when soil is not receptive, physically, chemically, biologically, ecologically, really is a waste of precious fertilizer, and it's a jeopardy because most of the fertilizer will go back into the environment, either into the water resources or into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide. That brings us to the topic of regenerative agriculture, which is the focus of this conference this morning. Regenerative agriculture is not a practice. Please understand, there is no one practice under the regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture is a concept, it's a philosophy, it's an ideology, it's an approach. It's an approach which is inspired by eco-innovation. It's an approach which is powered by a known carbon energy. It's a strategy driven by a circular economy and green infrastructure. And it's a suggestive idea supported by the recarbonization of the terrestrial biosphere as the bedrock of sustainable development. Soils of Africa depleted of their carbon content, the restoration, increasing the carbon stock is the basic concept. Many people think, does it mean organic agriculture? It may be, or it may not be. The main concept of regenerative agriculture is based on the basic principle called the law of return. Law of return. And the law of return states that anything taken out from soil must be returned to the same spot. Does not matter how you return it. If you do not return what you take out of the soil, soil cannot keep functioning. Soil is like a bank account. You can never withdraw from the bank account more than what you deposited into it. So to assume that you can keep withdrawing from the soil without returning something into it, as organic or inorganic, through biological fixation, through crop residue management, through recycling micronutrients, or integrated soil fertility management, you have to do that. The idea in terms of the carbon sequestration is creating a positive ecosystem carbon budget. Remember, I said soil is a bank account. So in a bank account, carbon is a currency. So your deposit of carbon into the soil must always be more than the carbon being depleted from the soil. Depletion of the carbon from the soil happens by erosion, by leaching, by decomposition. You must know how much that is lost. It's like what you're withdrawing from your bank account for paying tuition, grocery, paying farm bill, and all those kind of things. But you adding carbon back through biochar, through compost, through cover crop, through residue, through crop residue management, from manuring, whatever. Input must be more. Unfortunately, on a continental scale in Africa, at the moment, we have a negative carbon budget and we have a negative nutrient budget. This must stop. It has to stop. The business as usual of continuing is not an option. In fact, when the organic carbon concentration by extractive farming goes below 0.25%, 0.3%, 0.5%, improved varieties, even irrigation, even dumping fertilizer has absolutely no efficiency, no effectiveness. Soils are not responsive. And when you adopt the fertilizer, remember I mentioned that we want to go from 17 kilogram per hectare beyond up, maybe 50 kilogram per hectare, hopefully by 2030 or soon thereafter. We should still follow the slogan of CNPK, not NPK. Yes, NPK, calcium, magnesium, micronutrients are all essential, important, we must add. But before adding those, we must have C, build up the carbon concentration in the soil by cover cropping, such as pigeon peas, such as mucuna, such as Staloxanthes, such as centrosemas, many grasses which are cover crops. Cover crop become a very important component of restoring the carbon stock. And when cover crops and crop residue are combined with no-till farming, that's called conservation agriculture. So you are not plowing, you are leaving the crop residue on the surface, you're growing a cover crop, you are following integrated soil fertility management. I never said no fertilizer adding. Integrated soil fertility management, and then having a complex rotation which involve interaction of crops with trees and livestock. Integration of crops with trees and livestock as agroforestry, agro-silvopastoral system, complex system. And this way we can sustain productivity on a long-term basis. The question is, if farmers switch from their current system to what we just described, will they have a potentially higher productivity? Mind you, soil restorative regenerative technique may sometime improve soil health, but not necessarily produce the maximum yield. And this discrepancy must be understood, that not all soil restorative techniques produce the maximum yield at the same time. They will produce satisfactory yield during the worst condition scenario, but not always the best yield. Therefore, farmer must be incentivized. They must be compensated for taking risk. And the compensation for creating ecosystem services such as carbon is not paying them $2 or $4 or $6. No, that's undervaluing a very precious resource. The societal value of carbon is about $130 per ton of carbon. That comes to about $30 to $35 of credit, 1 ton of CO2. If a farmer sequesters half a ton of carbon per hectare, they must get $65. If they sequester 1/3 ton, they must get $43. Anything less than that is not being fair. And the role of private sector, whether it's Syngenta, whether it's Bayer, whether it's PepsiCo, many other organizations, John Deere, fertilizer companies, they can play a very, very critical role in translating science into action. Why? How? By promoting nature positive agriculture, by increasing access to input, by improving investment in agriculture research and development, and making sure that the farmers have inputs available on a timely fashion, especially now that we have disruption because of the war in East Africa. Africa needs a roadmap. I wish I could share this table with you. For example, right now, fertilizer uses 17 kilogram per hectare. By 2025, maybe we should think about 25 kilogram. By 2030, maybe 50 kilogram. By 2070, maybe 100 kilogram. We must have a plan. Irrigated cropland area right now is 6%. By 2030, it should be 20%. By 2050, it should be 75%. Conservation agriculture right now is only 1.5 million hectare. By 2030, it should be 20 million hectare. By 2040, maybe 50 million hectare. We must have an agenda for a continental scale at the same time for a national scale. And I'm very disappointed and sad to say that I have not seen this kind of plan where we want to be compared to where we are now. Unless we have that plan, we cannot even go to a donor and say, help us to do what? That what part is very important. You must have a plan. Here is a plan for fertilizer going up. Here is a plan for irrigated land area under drip sub fertilizer. Here is under conservation agriculture. Here is our plan for agroforestry. Here is for plan for improved varieties. We must have that plan. We must have that roadmap. And this is where some of the cooperation that we mentioned this morning, CASH, you are hearing from Leanne in a moment. CASH is aimed at on-the-ground translation of science into action, involving the local hubs such as ICA in Central America, ICRA, of course, AGRA in Africa, JIRCA, and CGIAR systems, and so forth. We should think about on the ground by selecting benchmark locations, all the way from Cape Coast to Marrakesh. Have a transact, select communities under different agroecoregion of different socioeconomic and biophysical factors of different cropping systems, and do the on-the-ground translation of science into action. You could have similar transact, say, from Morocco to eastern part of the Egypt, or from Senegal to Somalia, transact covering different ecoregions, on the ground evaluation of recommended management practices, which could be a very rapid translation. And my last point, Mr. Moderator, is the point that Professor Ruth mentioned, the critical situation in Horn of Africa and the famine situation. And I want to say very clearly, very loudly, not very diplomatically, famines are human-made problems. That's a fact. Famines are man-made tragedies, aggravated by natural hazards, but human are the cause of them. We must make famine and mass starvation, therefore, politically intolerable, morally toxic, ethically unthinkable, and humanly unacceptable. Look at the situation wherever the famine is, the conflict, civil strife, political instability, poor distribution. Those are the problems. And these are man-made problems. And we have to solve them. That requires a political will, power to address. Finally, the war in Europe has not helped. The war has aggravated food insecurity. We had 35 million refugees before the war. We have now more than 45 million, approaching 50. And there is no end in sight. War had disrupted food distribution. It has inhibited availability of agriculture in food. It has adversely affected people and the soil. Can you imagine the soil being cratered, being polluted, being heavy machinery, destroying biodiversity, everything. And yet nobody's thinking about stopping it. I do not know why. All those big powers of the world, stop it if you want to be called power. Because this war is hurting human and the land, human and the soil. And they both is going to require healing on a generational scale. Think of Vietnam. It is still not recovered. So please, I make a plea, stop the war. And then peace will follow with a healthy soil. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ratan Lal, for that very important keynote address. And the main message coming out of here is that we should follow the slogan of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in everything we do, in looking at these regenerative approaches as a means to address global challenge in agriculture productivity. And I know quite a number of people probably have a few questions. You can put them in the chat box. We still have a question and answer time after this to be able to address that towards the end. We'd like to move to the next presenter. We'll give the keynote address, and that is Professor Ken Gila. Professor Gila is a professor in Plant Production Systems Group at Wageningen Center for Agroecology and System Analysis in Wageningen University. And he's going to give a keynote address on how to achieve both food security and regenerative agriculture in African smallholder contexts from agronomic perspective. And I believe he's joining us from Western Ireland this afternoon, where I know it's always raining. But Professor Gila, please, the opportunity is yours.
Well, thanks very much indeed. And thanks to the organizers for the invitation to speak to you today. And I hope we can have the slides up on the screen, because I understand you're controlling them that end. So I've used this title today, Why the Buzz on Regenerative Agriculture? Why do we get so much excitement around this topic of regenerative agriculture, and why now? Next slide, please. Now, I wrote a paper which was published in 2021 because I was confused actually by this whole focus on regenerative agriculture. We wrote this paper looking at the topic from an agronomic perspective, and it's attracted an incredible amount of interest. I've never known a paper that I've written and here published in a fairly obscure journal that's attracted so much interest in the public media. Particularly that number there, that 236 is an alt metric, which shows how much that was picked up. And we looked at this sort of crisis that people are claiming is happening in the world around agriculture, the collapse of soil health, the plateauing of yields, and regenerative agriculture is coming then to be the answer to all of these things. In the next slide, we looked at the definitions of regenerative agriculture and where did it come from? And it really finds its root in the organic movement in the United States. This is from Robert Rodale of the Rodale Institute, looking at focus on land, the soil biological base, economic, biological stability, minimal to no impact on the environment, free from biocides, reliance on non-renewable resources. And Dick Harwood here, actually writing in a conference on Tanzania in 1983. So Africa was involved in the discussion on regenerative agriculture a long time back, really highlighting this idea of self-reliance on closed nutrient flow loops. So looking at local recycling of nutrients as a key of regenerative agriculture. On the next slide, we see then what we could find in terms of, well, what do people really mean by regenerative agriculture? And Professor Lal already introduced this. It's not one practice, it's a whole body of thought and work and philosophy, you could argue. But here we looked at these principles, and most of these principles are really very sensible principles in agronomy. Minimizing tillage, maintaining cover, building soil carbon, as Professor Lal really emphasized, relying on biological cycles, diversity of plants, integrating livestock, reducing pesticide use and encouraging water percolation. So all of these principles are really seem very sensible. In the center there, though, are the practices which are recommended. And many of these, again, are things which people would recognize, looking for zero-till, mulch, and the like, agroforestry. But some of them then become rather peculiar, rather specific. Compost tea. We've got inoculation of compost. We have permaculture, things which maybe work some places, but probably not everywhere. Focus on the holistic grazing of Alan Savory. And in the third column, you can see a big focus on soil health and a lesser focus on the reversal of biodiversity loss, but that also being mentioned. In the next slide, these are really the points that we found critical, if you like, of the discussion on regenerative agriculture currently. First of all, is that it seemed to take very little attention to the diversity of agricultural systems worldwide and the fact that different places start in different places. In the Netherlands, where I live and work most of the time, there's an excess of nutrients in the livestock sector, particularly, which needs to be addressed. But in Africa, as we'll see, we're starting in a very different place in terms of nutrition of our soils. But very little attention is given to these starting points or to the local context in much of the writing. The next point is that all agrochemicals seem to be bundled under one banner. We have to get rid of agrochemicals, when effectively the concerns for human and environmental health from fertilizers, nutrients, which are environmentally benign when used in the right way, and pesticides, which are specifically designed to kill things, but specifically, they differ enormously. And yet there's very little attention in the literature on regenerative agriculture given to alternative methods of pest and disease control if pesticides are reduced. And then finally, this point is that the focus seems to be so much on agricultural techniques rather than the integrated farm system as a whole. Little consideration of the broader landscape, of the ecological footprint of agriculture, and of this idea of land sparing, because people are arguing in places we should be reducing yields. But if we do that, where's that food going to come from? Are we simply going to push the production to other parts of the world? In the next slide, this graph on the left here shows what's happened since 1961. So at the base there, where we look at 100, that's what the area harvested was on the x-axis in 1961 against the cereal yield on the vertical axis. And you'll see On the left side of the graph, in the green and in the gray, in North America and Europe, yields have increased enormously, and the area in agriculture has gone down. We've been taking land out of agriculture on those continents. In the middle there, you'll see these lines going up in Asia, East Asia, South Asia, in Latin America, huge increases in yield since 1961, with some increases in land area, but not so strong as in Africa in the red, where you can see yields have increased very marginally compared to the yields in 1961, but the land area being used for agriculture has increased enormously. And this is summarized in a paper that we cite there, which we wrote for the IFAD Rural Development Report. And on the right is this picture of a soil in Africa, a soil in Zimbabwe, which is very depleted. And in the next slide, we focus in here, and here we have it in a microcosm. This is, if you like, the issue of Africa all in one slide. Close to the household there, you've got well-managed fertile soil, farmers knowing how to manage their soil to get good yields, but going away from the house, this depleted, infertile soil. And as I'll discuss with you, this is due then to the lack of inputs, the lack of fertilizer or organic manure going into that soil. So here we've got a depleted soil, which we could argue is ripe for regeneration. It's ready for regeneration, but how can that take place? In the next slide, I've spent the majority of my career working on these fantastic potential solutions to these problems. Nitrogen fixing legumes, on the right there, the agroforestry tree fallows, on the left, green manures, in the middle, grain legumes, that's groundnut, and down below, legume forages, that's stylosanthes in Madagascar. But in the next slide, you'll see on smallholder farms, they often don't work. Here we are in the field, an international group of researchers, including, in fact, the DG of CIMMYT at the time, looking at a crotalaria green manure together with farmers, all of us embarrassed because we take our technology out onto these depleted soils and they don't work. And just in this way, as Dr. Koyama in his introduction said this morning, there are no silver bullets. Things don't work everywhere. We've got to look for locally tailored solutions. In the next slide, and introduce you here, it's a bit of a complex slide, but this is work that we were doing in our project on Into Africa, looking at grain legumes. So here we've got soybean in northern Nigeria. On the bottom axis, it's the yield in a control plot. In the vertical axis, in the graph, yield in a test plot where we had either phosphorus added, but no inoculum. That's the blue diamonds. We've got the squares, which are no phosphorus, just inoculation. And in the green triangles, we've got phosphorus and inoculation. And you can see big increases in yield with phosphorus inoculation. The mean effects on the right going from less than a ton, 968 kilos, up to 1,800 kilos almost, 1,745. So nearly doubling yields. But if you go down to the left-hand side of that graph, down close to the zero control yield, the zero point of the graph, you'll see that there's very little response to the treatments. And you might imagine that where phosphorus is least, you've got the least yield to start with, you get the biggest response. But we find lots of soils where we don't get that response. And in the next slide, you can see here what happens when it really works well. This extension worker, in his left hand, the control plot, in his right hand, soybeans from the plot with inoculum and phosphorus. The next slide. But this is what happens when it doesn't work. And we went into the field here in northern Nigeria, imagining, well, the experiment was done wrong. It must have been sown late. It's not been weeded. But close to where this farmer's standing, and when we zoom into the farmer, you see there's a plant that's doing very well. And that's a plant that obviously had received some gift from a passing animal in the previous season, where the soil was actually fertile. So we've taken these soils from these very, what we call non-responsive soils, where our technologies are not working. And in the next slide, using these double pot experiments, and the next slide in the glass house, you can see responses to different treatments. I can't go into the detail, but the next slide actually shows the responses. And we see here deficiencies of phosphorus, deficiencies of magnesium, deficiencies of micronutrients, and maybe some other problems in the control we thought were maybe even a toxicity of manganese. So these are very infertile soils, and this is what needs to be regenerated, of course, in order to be able to get productive agriculture going. The next slide shows us another example. Here on the left, climbing beans with no manure. On the right, climbing beans with manure and some phosphorus added. And those beans, I'm actually 2 meters tall, would be way above my head, over 3 meters above the ground, hugely productive, moving to yields of 5 tons of climbing bean grain yield per hectare. And in Rwanda, beans is basically the major staple food. But the beans without soil amendments, without particularly the addition of phosphorus, are really not giving us that boost. The next slide shows the benefit of the climbing beans on the next crop. On the left of the slide, you'll see maize after maize. It's not actually growing too badly in these soils. This is in eastern DRC, in fact. And on the right, there's maize after climbing beans, and you can see this fantastic residual effect. So legumes, again, can boost the yield of the next crop. And the next slide, and Professor Lal mentioned this, pigeon pea, fantastic legume. Pigeon pea maize intercropping. On the left, you can see a white arrow showing a pigeon pea plant under the maize. In the center is the maize ready for harvest. On the right is after maize harvest, and you'll see the pigeon pea then growing on into the dry season. We looked at this, next slide, actually in eastern Mozambique. And on the left, you see there the nice soil cover left after pigeon pea. This was actually a conservation agriculture plot where we weren't tilling. And on the right, we've got the responses after 3 years. 3 years of soil maize, giving us 1/2 ton. A distinct row intercrop, so that's where maize was replaced with, maize rows were replaced with pigeon pea rows, giving us less than 2 tons of maize. And then on the right, we've got a within row intercrop, so basically maize with pigeon pea added into the maize, the same population, giving us 5 tons of grain, which was the same as on the right as a maize grown after 3 years of sole pigeon pea. So the residual benefit of the legume being incredibly strong, with the additional grain yield in the gray from the pigeon pea. And if you click next, please, presenter, to the next slide, you'll see the sole maize basically wasn't producing because of this pretty little plant, which is Striga asiatica, which was completely suppressed under the intercrop to give us this yield of 5 tons of maize in a situation where actually in this soil, which was a good soil, we didn't even add any basal fertilizer. Pigeon pea does so well, the next slide, because it has amazing taproot. And here we've some slides from Tanzania, Freddy Baijukia, Esther Mugi, where we've been looking at the taproot systems of these going down more than 2 meters, which allows the pigeon pea to grow into the dry season, producing biomass, which can then be used as mulch for the maize. So a great example of what legumes can do. Next slide, please. But when we look across our situation in Africa, what we've been finding, and this is also from work we did for the IFAD Rural Development Report, this critical problem of farm size. This is based on World Bank data, the best survey data we can find. And what we find is that farm sizes are getting critically small. If you look across these graphs, many areas, the median farm size is now less than 1 hectare. And imagine trying to feed and clothe your whole family from 1 hectare of land or less. where you're often thinking of 6 to 8 family members. So a critical role of farm size. But the next slide with this paper just shows we've not been paying enough attention to this diversity of farms in our thoughts. Very often the technologies that we produce are picked up by the farmers with more land. But we have this paper we've just published as a review where we found a critical limited number of papers which really address these unequal impacts of farm technologies. The fact that basically the smallest farms are often in a position where they can't adopt these technologies because they don't have sufficient resources to do so. And I think when we're thinking about our implementation of programs in Africa, we need to recognize this critical issue of small farm size, which of course determines what technologies people are able to take on and whether they can achieve food security or not. Next slide, please. Now, I put up this on agroecology. This isn't the FAO 10 principles. This is the high-level panel of experts, 13 principles, but it builds on the FAO definitions. I'm sure we'll hear more from Dr. Barrios later. And I think these principles, as with regenerative agriculture, all generally make sense, except for one in this slide, which is input reduction. Input reduction makes sense in some places, but in Africa, if we're going to get agriculture off the ground, we need to increase our inputs. And this is what Professor Lal very eloquently called the law of return. Absolutely, if we don't return what we take off, we're going into declining soil fertility. The next slide, please. So these are the guidelines that we drew up in our paper on regenerative agriculture, of how we should engage with it, if you like, from a development perspective or from an agronomic perspective. So first of all, what is the problem we're trying to address? What's to be regenerated? Obviously, that determines what the approach we should have. The next is what agronomic mechanism can enable or facilitate that regeneration. And I think in terms of soil fertility, I'd wholeheartedly endorse Professor Lal's point about integrated soil fertility management and the need for extra inputs to boost soil fertility. The fourth is how can that be integrated into an agronomic practice, which will be environmentally and socially viable in the context for the local people. So very much context specific. And I gave you some examples here of legumes which do that. And what would the political, social, or economic forces be that could drive the adoption of that practice? So my concluding slide then is basically to say, well, regenerative agriculture is here to stay. It's got the movement. There's a huge positive momentum, NGOs, companies, governments moving towards regenerative agriculture. I think it does basically move the goalpost from what we call sustainable intensification, which would say, let's intensify but do no harm, to a do better approach. Let's try and make sure our interventions are making better for both farmers and for the environment. There is a lack of a clear definition, but I think that in a sense that might be a help because it allows for better local interpretation of what it means in a local context, which I think is key. Because although we have this common set of principles, the diversity of farms, farming systems, the starting points means that we need this tailored approach in terms of practices. I think measuring and monitoring is going to remain a challenge throughout, but we definitely need a farming systems level understanding to generate the organic resources we need to restore the soil. We need inputs of nutrients, and we need to look at that in terms of the broader farming system and not just thinking of technology. And with that, on the next slide, I'd like to thank some co-authors, to thank many of our collaborators on the N2 Africa project. This is what I presented. And the very last slide is an invitation to you all. There should be one more. Yeah, because we have this table debates, online debates around the food system. I'd like to invite you all to engage there in discussion about how we're going to build a better world in relation to our food supply. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ken, for this very informative presentation, which is very clear that there's no silver bullet to all these regenerative agriculture approaches, and it should be tailored based on the local context. We really appreciate that. And again, I would like to urge all participants to hold on to their questions. There's a question and answer session coming towards the end, where we can be able to learn more a little bit on some of these questions which you may have. So just hold on to that. At this juncture, we'd like to move to some practical experiences which is going on in addition to what Ken just presented. And these are field reports based on a few practical experiences which can help guide us in this important approach on regenerative agriculture. And we'd like to start with Dr. Fentahun Mengistu, who we'd like to invite. Dr. Mengistu is a country director for Sasakawa Africa Association in Ethiopia, and the former Director General of the Ethiopian Institute of Agricultural Research, who is bringing to us a very wide experience and a wide perspective on regenerative agriculture practices in action, looking at Ethiopia in particular. Fentahun, please, you go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mel, distinguished participants. In the following few minutes, I would like to highlight you Sasakawa Africa Association's translating the science of regenerative agriculture into practice, taking Ethiopia as an example. Next, please. By way of introduction, Ethiopia is a country of diversity with more than 32 agroecologists, abundant resources, water, arable land, moderately natural forests, and also houses the largest of livestock population in Africa. And of course, Ethiopia is one of the pavilion center of crop origin and diversity. Next, please. However, since the late 20th century, Ethiopian landscape, rural and agricultural landscape faced severe challenges in terms of land degradation, deforestation, ecological degradation imbalances, soil erosion, acidity, salinity, poor drainage, and biotic and abiotic factors, combined with poor agricultural practice and of course, some socioeconomic challenges. Next, please. So our biodiversity also being a center of origin, it's declining from time to time. The National Statistics Agency is reporting only 51 crops dominated by cereals, more than 80%, leaving only 20% for pulses and oil crops. Next, please. So looking at the current Ethiopian agricultural landscape, we see subsistence agriculture. A small-scale agriculture is dominant. And this system and model of agriculture was not able to actually help us achieve the desired productivity, although in terms of sustainability, it's moderately sustainable. But the emerging commercial agriculture over the last 2 decades, as you might see from this graph, Ethiopia could register a substantial productivity gain over use of moderate inputs as well as improved varieties. But unfortunately, this system of commercial agriculture is less sustainable or unsustainable. As a result, over the Ethiopian landscape, we see both sustainable and unsustainable practices coexist. For instance, you can see from these pictures, farmers' practices of mixed cropping, parkland agroforestry, coffee agroforestry, and also you can see transitioning landscape. In this graph, maize becoming dominant, and of course, in the extreme cases, a kind of monocropping agriculture is taking place. Ethiopia was also able to register really a very important achievement, a very good achievement in natural resource restoration, landscape restoration, but unfortunately, we see this restoration in farmlands. Next, please. So Sasakawa learning from its own interventions over the last 3.5 decades in the line of commercial agriculture, we came at this point to shift to transit to regenerative agriculture as a potential solution for the aforementioned problems. I would like to remark here that neither subsistence agriculture nor the emerging commercial agriculture seen in isolation would enable us to achieve the dual objective of productivity and environmental objectives. So this implies that we need to draw from the existing practices from subsistence agriculture, but we need also to embed it with emerging commercial agriculture. I would like also to note that unlike regenerative agriculture in the developed world, we need to see an African way, an Ethiopian way of regenerative agriculture. In this case, the drivers for regenerative agriculture in Ethiopia, in Africa, is not primarily to reduce excessive use of external inputs or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Rather, the entry point should be reducing environmental degradation, achieve resource use efficiency, increasing productivity, of course, reducing agricultural and environmental footprints, as well as climate change adaptation. Sasakawa Africa Association started conservation tillage, which is part of conservation agriculture, in 1998, but as of 2021, it integrated regenerative agriculture in its 5-year strategy. And so for Sasakawa, regenerative agriculture means any principle, any practice that help us to conserve, protect, regenerate, or enhance primarily soils and as well agroecosystems, but at the same time, practices that increase agricultural productivity. Therefore, in its 5-year strategy, regenerative agriculture took center stage. And Sasakawa believes that regenerative agriculture can be addressed through 2 major pathways. One is integrated soil fertility management, and the other one is conservation agriculture. And of course, this has to be also integrated with agroecological intensification and an agriculture that is nutrient sensitive as well as market oriented. In a nutshell, the regenerative agriculture approach Sasakawa will follow both agroecology and agro-technological interventions and practices. And of course, Sasakawa also believed that the planning unit should be the whole community, and the planning unit should be the entire agricultural value chain. Next, please. Just to what I said is on our on-farm interventions would be concentrating on conservation agriculture, integrated fertility management practices, but this needs to be also linked to the external environment, to agroecosystems at landscape level with landscape level interventions. I don't want to go to the detail, but Sasakawa follows certain steps to implement regenerative agriculture, understanding the system, and identifying the entry point, building the capacity of farmers and extension agents, setting up demonstrations in the farmer training centers, and also, of course, tracking our progress like yield and income and some environmental and social variables, and of course, learning, gathering feedbacks, iterating, and scaling. Next, please. So I'm now going to show you just a few practical examples within the framework of conservation agriculture and integrated soil fertility management. One is on reducing soil mechanical disturbance, which is the basic principle of conservation agriculture. In this case, I will focus on tillage. In Ethiopia, tillage, the more you till, the more you are uploaded. And in some cereals, up to 12 times need to be tilled to grow your crops. And this is done through this ARD plow. The ARD plow, along with the plowshare, has been in use for thousands of years, and it is actually the reason for farmers to go for repetitive tillage. So Sasakawa promotes or zero minimum tillage using a kind of improved farm implement called Berkamaresha, which is a step flow that helps actually reduce the frequency of tillage. Next, please. Another practice of the part of conservation agriculture is maintaining permanent soil cover. Our farmers, they cut at harvest their crops just at the ground level because the crop residues are put into different competing uses. So Sasakawa is promoting a higher cutting, promoting mulching, leaving crop residues on the surface. But most importantly, we are also promoting cover crops like using cowpea, vetch, and other crops, especially in areas where rainfall is bimodal and in areas where the soil moisture is good. Next, please. And the second principle of conservation agriculture is, of course, fostering plant diversity. In this case, our landscape is being simplified because of in favor of high-yielding varieties and market orientation. So Sasakawa promotes spatial and temporal farm diversification. In this case, activities like intercropping, relay cropping, rotational cropping, agroforestry, etc., are being practiced, taking into consideration compatibility, agroecological compatibility, and of course, the value of the companion crops. Next, please. Another aspect of the conservation agriculture in fostering plant diversity is actually crop rotation. In Ethiopia, crop rotation has been actually an established practice, but because of land shortage and commercial orientation, these days, crop rotation is waning, and farmers have to go only 2 to 3 years, a very short rotation, or completely abandon and go for monocropping. So Sasakawa promotes longer duration rotations, as well as inclusion of pulses, but also introducing actually new crops and varieties to the intervention areas. You might see here in this graph that in one study, we found that farmers are practicing only 20% of the farmers are practicing crop rotation. Next, please. Well, within the conservation agriculture framework, probably one area where we also liken with the regenerative agriculture in developed countries without external inputs is permagardening, or what we call it permaculture. Sasakawa promotes permagardening, especially in homestead niches, to address nutrition, gender, income, as well as environmental problems with local resources, local labor, household labor, water-saving technologies, as well as minimum soil disturbance to grow vegetables, herbs, spice, and perennial plants. Next, please. Another practice Sasakawa is promoting is actually mainstreaming climate-smart agriculture. While we mainstream climate-smart agriculture across our all interventions, especially in drier areas, we have what we call them climate-smart villages. In this, we promote water harvesting activities, climate-smart practices, climate-resilient crops, but also actually linking with the landscape restoration with the community, and also actually training and capacity building of farmers on nutrition and social and behavioral change aspects. Next, please. The second pathway to promote regenerative agriculture Sasakawa follows is integrated soil fertility management, as has been mentioned by Professor Lal a few minutes ago. And this one is in organic inputs. I would want to mention here, repeat it here, because fertilizer application rates are very low, as has been presented. And this is going to be actually even might be lower because of the current situation, like Russia-Ukraine war. Not only that, fertilizer utilization is not only, the rate is not low, but also the agronomic efficiency is also, we are not efficient in using fertilizers properly. So Sasakawa is promoting optimal and efficient use of inorganic fertilizers, whereas along with organic inputs and good agronomic practices. Next, please. Next, please. In the area of organic inputs, of course, there are several. Please, the previous. In the area of the previous slide, please. In the area of inorganic organic inputs, SASACOA is promoting manure, compost, green marine, and so on. And probably another area under integrated soil fertility management SASACOA is promoting is the use of genetics, actually. Alongside of indigenous and local varieties, SASACOA is promoting varieties of special attributes like nutrient responsive, heat tolerant, pest tolerant, etc. And we also actually promote agronomic and input use efficiency, for instance, on fertilizers, on water, and also using and promoting a kind of artificial intelligence tool, what we call TICAD8 in collaboration with SoftBank. And of course, other good agronomic practices, integrate pests, diseases, and weeds management, good agricultural practices such as option by context approach, and not least the highlands in Ethiopia. There is a crop livestock integrated farming system. So SASACOA doesn't directly involve in livestock management, but we introduce higher biomass crops or varieties. We also integrate forage crops along with cropping system. We also encourage in situ managing. And next, please. And finally, I think we see really favorable conditions to promote array transition. One is actually existing of farmers' indigenous knowledge and practices. We are not going actually for convert farmers. Farmers already know it, want to actually build on that. Labor and oxygen shortage as well as price, rising organic fertilizer prices, and enabling policies are actually favorable conditions to promote regenerative agriculture. But it's not without challenges. The challenges, next please. The challenges in promoting regenerative agriculture are unlearning farmers' repetitive tillage practices and control livestock grazing, balancing short-term, long-term objectives, incentives for transitioning, collective action, as well as conflict with actually a kind of commercial agricultural interest. And next, please. And finally, if array is to succeed in Africa, in Ethiopia, I think we need to consider both farmers' aspirations as well as macro development objectives. We need to build on existing practices. Economic incentives are important. We need also to go beyond individual farm and farm into community and landscape planning. And we need to also go beyond production into downstream value chain. And of course, finally, we need more favorable enabling policies and solidarities and partnerships. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fentahun, for that very informative presentation. And that just covers the context of what SASACOA Africa Association is doing in Ethiopia, representative of East Africa. If you go to West Africa and different areas, you find a different context altogether. And now building up on that, we'd like to welcome the next presenter, who is Dr. Kofi Boa. Kofi Boa is Executive Director of the Center for No-Till Agriculture, who will give us a perspective on the conservation agriculture practices in Ghana. Dr. Boa is a former cocoa agronomist at Crop Research Institute in Ghana and has done incredible work in this field. Dr. Boa, please, opportunity is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm Kofi Boa from Ghana. I'm speaking on conservation agricultural practices in Ghana. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, you know, Ghana is predominantly, go back, please. Ghana is predominantly an agricultural nation. It employs about 70% of the people, but what you realize is that smallholder farming is predominant. About 80% of us are engaged in the smallholder farming, but just like all other nations, smallholder farming is having a lot of challenges and is coming as a result of declining yields, which is impacting seriously on food security and overall livelihoods. The problem, like in other places, have been linked to land degradation, of course, amplified by climate change. Seriously, it has more to do with the way land is prepared, always having bare lands as a result of the slash and burn and plowing in the dryland areas, which is causing a lot of problems as far as loss of organic matter is concerned and resulting in reduced resilience in soils. So I came out with this Center for No-Till Agriculture, which is a nonprofit and NGO, to show the benefits and evidence and processes of conservation agriculture so that we could help improve and sustain the productivity of the farmlands in an environmentally and friendly manner. Next slide. So here, we are going to talk about key field practices that farmers are employing, but keeping in mind the three interlinked principles. Next slide. What we see, starting from land preparation, at the center, you have a field, a soil completely covered with mulch. And so our premise is being able to plant on a field completely, on an untilled field completely covered with mulch. And we come through this coming from several angles. On the other side, you see, we're using the traditional tools, the cutlass, to be able, we show farmers to be able to slash and settle the mulch so that in the end, we have a uniform cover that we can plant through. We are also moving ahead, getting farmers to use the handheld slasher wherever appropriate to be able to settle the mulch. Then, of course, as we continue to move through to go up in acreages, say 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, we employ the use of smaller tractors that will move the roller crimper to settle the mulch so that to settle the vegetation, we get a mulch to be able to plant through without burning. And then, of course, judicious use of herbicide, which is also part of the system to be able to help us get a mulch and be able to plant through at the time of planting. Next slide. In places where the soils are crusted, especially, please back. Please, go back. Yes, in places where the soils are crusted, especially in the dryland areas of the north, farmers begin to use the rape tillage, which is a minimum tillage practice. And here there are two things. We get farmers to use the traditional hoe, a modified traditional hoe, to be able to make the rape line. As you see, we're helping a farmer transition into that. But when we move into the acreages like 3, 4, 5, 6, where appropriate, we then use a tractor-mounted 2-tine ripper to be able to break the crust. And then we use the rape lines as the planting lines in the transitional system. Next slide. Next slide, and then we are looking at planting through the mulch. And here, the two systems that you see, we're using the dibbling stick, something that the farmers know how to use already. And we are using that within the mulch to open up, to get an open spot to be able to plant. And just as we use the cutlass to plant. So 2 traditional tools we are still employing in the no-till systems, in the conservation agri systems. Next slide. So as we move to the next slide, what you see is that we are also encouraging the use of more efficient systems of planting. And so in the mechanical system, this is where we are using the jar planter, getting farmers to be able to use the jar planter, a 2-pot jar planter, which will allow them to plant the seed and apply the fertilizer at the same time in the mulch. And then as we move into the acreages, 4, 5, 6, 10, then we employ the use of the smallholder mechanized system like the 2-row no-till planter, which can also then plant through the mulch. And in other cases, we have a 4-pot, which then will apply 2 rows of maize at the same time with a fertilizer pot. Next slide. So going through the 3 interlinked principles, we also make sure that there is permanent cover at the time of planting. And so we completely get farmers to discourage burning and more so that we're able to get a mulch to be able to plant through. But more importantly, what we are looking at is that we look at a situation where farmers are able to plant a good seed of a good variety of a food crop just the same time as the cover crop. And we promote extensively the use of cover crops. There are several cover crops that we are promoting to ensure that there is permanent cover. Next slide. And coming through to the next slide, what we are doing is that still looking at the three interlinked principles, we are looking at a situation where we have crop diversity, mixed cropping, so that at the end of the day, the farmer has so much insurance in terms of variations in the weather, and also be able to have diversified food on the diet, diversified diet at the table. So we encourage so much intercropping and crop rotation. As you see, cereal legume intercropping and then cereal legume rotation. But we encourage strip cropping, which allows farmers, even on the small plot, to be able to do intensive crop rotation. And of course, as we begin to do all these things, we also encourage the use of, external inputs. We must stress that our approach to conservation agriculture is not equating conservation agriculture to organic farming. And so wherever needed, wherever possible, whatever there is to do to prompt the system is allowed. Next slide. Next slide, please. So there are several other practices. We also encourage early cropping, where we use leguminous shrubs like Gliricidia, prunings, to ensure that we build the biomass and be able to plant through. We also ensure that there is retention of dispersed trees on the farmland, which is very, very important to, help moderate the microclimate, and at the same time, be able to have resting places for the farmers, and more also, some of these dispersed fruits trees are fruit trees that offer economic importance. Now, more and more in the valleys, in the permanent, we encourage the use of permanent flatbeds and the furrow system, so that both during the rainy season, the wet season, and the dry season, farmers are able to make use of the wetlands. Of course, in order to be able to further conserve soil and water on the slopes, we encourage the use of the A-frame to be able to delineate the contours and be able to plant within the contours in such a way that we are able to further enhance soil and water movement and keep everything in place. Next slide. The next slide, which is the last one, is just giving you our key strategies for ensuring farmers' understanding and acceptance of conservation agriculture. So what we do is a three-point strategy. The very first thing is that we build farmers' understanding of the concept of conservation agriculture. And here what we do is we bring them into participatory discussion as to the productivity of the forest or the fallow land, and try together with them, fish out what is exactly in the forest that makes it productive forever. And here we nail down to the three interlinked principles of minimal disturbance to the soil and the forest, permanent cover in the forest, and crop diversity, conferring on it the biological processes. So once we get farmers to understand the concept of conservation agriculture, they need to be convinced that it is a good system. And so we show evidence. So on top right, this is where you see a conservation agric plot side by side a traditional plot. And what you see there is the same variety planted the same day, treated similarly, except of course, this is always bare and this is covered. And so here, what happens is that the farmers, after they've understood the concept, they also see the benefits. And this is what we have going on at the Center for No-Till Agriculture. Several plots looking at different systems to show farmers the benefits and the evidence. Now the farmers get to understand. They get convinced that it works, but then they need to be empowered to be able to do it on their own. And that is where in the third strategy, we build hands-on practical skills. We bring them down, show them what to do so that they can implement that on their farms and show that to neighboring farmers. So what is happening here now is that we are able, through this, to build the understanding of the concept to show them the evidence so that they get convinced, and also show them hands-on so that they can do it on their own. And so with this 3-point strategy, we are able to get farmers to understand why they are doing the practices that we have guided them to do. The next slide is just to say thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boa, for this very practical presentation on what you are doing in Kumasi. And this is really important to show different tailor-made approaches which can fit within different farming systems. And we really appreciate the work that you're doing over there. I would like to again remind the participants that there's a question and answer chat box below there where you can post all your questions. We are coming to a question and answer session towards the end of this program. We'll be able to address most of your questions. So we'd like to move forward to the next field report, where we are going to invite Dr. Lee Winowiki. Dr. Lee Winowiki is a global research leader for soil and land health and the co-lead for Coalition of Action for Soil Health at the Center for International Forest Research and the World Agroforestry Center. This is CIFOR and ICRAF. And she has made very incredible contribution, if I remember, in the African Soil Information Systems, being part and parcel of the mapping systems, which has allowed us to know what the African soils are all about, and is currently leading an initiative on restoration of degraded lands in East Africa and the Sahel. So Dr. Lee, please, your presentation on advances in soil health monitoring for food and nutrition security, climate change action, and ecosystem restoration. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mel, for that very flattering introduction. I am so pleased to be here today and with this esteemed list of colleagues. So yes, today I'll be talking about advances in soil and land health monitoring. So on my next slide, in case people are not able to stay for the whole talk, or I just am not enthusiastic enough, I give you my key messages now. One, as Dr. Lal said, we can translate science into action to inform decisions. In fact, we do have the tools and methods to measure and track soil health. All the previous speakers highlighted this as a real need of generating the evidence on regenerative agriculture. My third point, through stewardship, we can improve soil health, as the previous speakers highlighted, and that encouraging this farmer innovation to tailor healthy soil practices to their context is critical for scaling. And then last point, as was mentioned, that public and private sector engagement is needed to bring equitable and transparent financial incentives to farmers. And this is something we're working on in the Coalition of Action for Soil Health. So the next slide just highlights the multiple functions and ecosystem services delivered by soil, multiple functions, as was mentioned. However, on the next slide, I highlight that between 20 and 40% of the Earth's surface is degraded. So the next slide is about, yes, degradation. So this is a photo my son took in Zambia on vacation, just demonstrating how widespread erosion is, limiting the soil's ability to deliver these critical functions, such as nutrient cycling, carbon storage, food and nutrition security. On the next slide, I ask us to come together for targeted investments in soil health in order to combat these challenges. And here we see that landscapes are diverse. So if we are talking about generating the evidence base, if we're talking about scaling regenerative ag, as Dr. Ken Gillard mentioned, landscapes are diverse. You're going to have to tailor the approach to the context. And this is true when monitoring. So when we're developing a monitoring framework, we must address this landscape variability. We must have a sampling design that captures this, which means we need cost-effective methodologies, and we need to be able to track changes over time. So in the next slide, I highlight one such methodology that we have been implementing at C4ECRAF. It's called the Land Degradation Surveillance Framework. Please allow me to just say LDSF. This was developed as a systematic and science-based assessment to monitor soil and land health. It assesses variability at multiple scales. This data are utilized to conduct robust statistical analysis to track changes over time, and we can produce high-quality maps. On the right are a list of indicators. Maybe if you get really close to the screen, you can see it's about vegetation cover, land management, soil hydrology, soil health variables. Dr. Lau asked us to remember biological, chemical, and physical aspects of the soil. The best part about this framework, on the next slide, I show a global map that has been used in over 43 countries. Obviously, there's some bias in Africa here. I think everyone knows ECRAF, World Agroforestry, is based in Africa, but we are working globally. Over 40 countries, governments, NGOs are using the LDSF. This data set allows us to track these changes over time and conduct the really robust statistical analysis that we need to across these systems. On the next slide, I talk about some of the advantages of having this systematic field sampling. This means that now we can combine with other methodologies. So the previous speaker, Dr. Kofi, mentioned engaging farmers. We can engage farmers in the monitoring. So that's assisted citizen science. And we've developed the Regreening Africa app on the Google Play Store, which is available for download to do just that. We have the LDSF. And then we have the remote sensing. So together, these technologies really provide us with tools to understand drivers of degradation, to better target interventions, and to track intervention progress across multiple indicators. So on the next slide, what is one of the indicators that we measure? Why are we here? Let's get grounded in the soil here. Soil organic carbon. It is a key indicator of soil health because it influences other soil processes such as water holding capacity, soil fertility. It also influences productivity. It also responds to management. Of course, we need an indicator that will respond to the management. So if we have poor agricultural practices, we will decrease organic carbon. While regenerative ag practices, where we input back into the soil, as Dr. Lau said, it's a bank account, we can increase soil carbon. It's quantifiable and it's rapid to measure. It's not the only indicator, but it is a key indicator. So what does the LDSF look like? On the next slide, I put 3 graphics here to demonstrate one of the beauties of the LDSF framework. It works at the site scale. So as Mel remembers from that project, we work at 100 square kilometer landscapes. And then each site has 16 clusters that are 1 square kilometer, and each cluster has 10 plots of 1,000 meters square. Now, what does this methodology mean? It's hierarchical. And it's actually exponentially based, so it's robust statistically. But then this means this is a lot of work in the field and we're collecting a lot of data. So the next slide shows just how much data we are collecting. 160 topsoil samples, 160 subsoil samples, plus the cumulative mass, a substitute for bulk density samples. That means we cannot use traditional wet chemistry in the soil laboratory to analyze these samples. It's just too expensive and it will be too slow. So the next slide shows that at C4ECRAF, along with many amazing partners, we've been leading and developing the use of soil spectroscopy, which is about shining a light on soil. It's robust, it's accurate, it's low cost, and you get multiple properties simultaneously. On the next slide, I show these these graphs that just look at the predictive accuracy for key indicators such as carbon, sand, clay, and pH. Over 0.9 R squared on the validation data sets. So we know it's accurate and it's published and it's a growing community, including at FAO Glosalon. So if we go to the applications on the next slide, What do we do with these data? How is this helpful to regenerative ag movement or agriculture in general? Well, if we go to the next slide, first thing is maps. This is a global map, and I believe it's the first ever global erosion map for 500-meter resolution. We published this in 2019. This can be used to improve global models, climate, of crop models. Then if we go to the next slide, we actually can zoom into Africa, looking at root depth restrictions and looking at where plants will have a physical constriction for their roots penetrating into the soil at the continental scale. The next slide shows how we've mapped. So I'm based here in Kenya, and the hotspots for erosion prevalence at the national scale, which can be used to target restoration interventions and also monitor changes over time. Let's hope I show a map of Kenya in 5 years, and this is not so glaringly bright yellow and red with high erosion. But then we're supposed to be talking about the farmers, right? So the next slide shows we are producing these maps at 10 and 30-meter resolution that is appropriate for the farm level. So here are some households in Makoini County, the red dots, where we've been tracking actually 10,000 households, how these restoration or regenerative ag practices are changing over time through better management. So we're using soil erosion here. The next slide shows soil carbon. So remember, it's about multiple indicators, and these are all maps with high accuracy and fine resolution. In the next slide, I just demonstrate how we've used this tool to look at climate change mitigation strategies. These are 4 LDSF sites. Actually, we have Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania here, and it's the same color code, but you can see the completely different patterns of soil organic carbon. Anyone from Kenya here? I think Ruth may know the Kipsing River. In the lower left, it's very low carbon. In the upper left, that's in Mbinga in southwestern Tanzania. Why do I know these sites? Because I was actually there sampling them. So we actually have mapped soil organic carbon stocks. And the next slide, the next 2 slides you can just go through, and the next slide are just maps at conservation level, and the next slide is an entire map of Rwanda, soil organic carbon. So we can produce these maps with countries, with partners to target. So now how do we bring in the citizen science? So the next slide is just highlighting the Regreening Africa app. So this is assisted citizen science. Farmers are going out to their fields, geo-referencing the boundaries of their field, and then recording what are they doing. Farmer managed natural regeneration, tree planting, nurseries, soil water conservation. Then we're able to overlay those polygons, those georeference plots with the maps and track how these interventions are changing over time. You can download this for free. Thousands are farmers, extension agents, NGOs are using this. Next slide, and you might need to press twice because I think there's an active thing. Yes, and one more. So this is about translating science into action to accelerate impact on the ground. And that's about placing farmers first. Yeah, so if you press next slide one more time, you'll see that. So here we were highlighted in Manga Bay, also Al Jazeera, about using the app, using these data to communicate with farmers to actually scale the restoration on the ground, which is really amazing. So in the next slide, I'm just going to give you the update on the Coalition of Action for Soil Health. I think everyone on this call should reach out to us and join the coalition. If you go to the next slide, the reason is because the main objective is to improve soil health globally by addressing implementation, monitoring, policy, and investment barriers that currently constrain farmers. We want to integrate soil health into policy. Let's make sure we have nationally determined contributions that include soil health. We need to expand the research and development, increase the number of hectares of land under soil health, and increase the investment. So the next slide just shows the number of members we have, over 100. The next slide shows what does success look like. And if you go to the CASH website, you'll find all of this, mainstreaming soil health, making sure we have agreed upon indicators. I heard Dr. Giller talk about needing a definition for regenerative. It's the same for soil health. The next slide shows that we were at the UNCCD COP15, where I hope everyone recognized there was strong commitment for soil and land health restoration globally. We brought together financial institutions, youth, NGOs, public sector, research, farmers organizations to come together to develop an action plan. So what does the action plan look like now? Well, on the next slide, you can find out by going to our website, follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. And the last slide is really about coming together as a community to support a soil health resolution at COP27. Please reach out to us. The resolution is online. We've reached out to member states, but we know, as Dr. Lal said, that soil is a critical storage for soil carbon contributing to climate change mitigation. So let's work together to bring this resolution. And with that, I thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, for that incredible information. There's a lot of information you packed in there. And I recall how you spent countless times, collecting thousands of soil samples. Some are falling on the mountains, in the national parks where you have lions and elephants and what have you, and how this is being translated into scientific and policy action today to allow us to help restore the African soils. We really appreciate your presentation. And again, I'm reminding our participants that they can put in their questions, in the chat, so if you have a critical question for Lee, she'll be able to answer during a question and answer session. So we really appreciate that. We'd like to move to another presentation on a research report, and this is going to come from Dr. Satoshi Nakamura from JIRCAS, focusing on research for the development of healthy soil for farmers to realize food security. And Satoshi is a project leader at JIRCAS, and he's been working actually since 2008 in developing soil fertility management technologies and options in West Africa with specific reference to Northern Ghana and Burkina Faso. Satoshi, please, opportunity is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mel. So I'd like to start my presentation about research for the development of healthy soil for farmers to realize food security. I'm Satoshi Nakamura from JIRCAS. Next slide, please. Today, I present to you these 4 points. 1, introduction of our institute, JIRCAS, and our consideration for regenerative agriculture for Africa, and potential technology which can contribute to soil health from our activities and towards soil health enhancement in Africa. Next slide, please. Our institute, Japan International Research Center for Agricultural Sciences, is working for providing solutions to global environmental problems, food insecurity, and extreme poverty by conducting international collaborations in the field of agriculture, forestry, fishery research. Our visions are solving global food and environmental issues and functioning as a core center. We have almost 50 years of history of international collaborations with partners in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These research were conducted under 3 research programs: environment, food, and information. As you can see on the map, most of the activities in Africa have been conducted under the food program. Next slide, please. Here, I'd like to talk about common challenge and the direction of expected change. It is well known that African farmers are struggling with low productivity due to low soil fertility. So soil health enhancement is expected. And unstable production due to unstable rainfall is a problem. We need to establish resilient agriculture for climate change impact. And farmers can use limited options of crop and agricultural techniques. So technology development is expected to deal with soaring demand and changing food needs. human resources are important. Capacity buildings, especially for new technologies, will be highly required. Next, please. To achieve soil health enhancement in Africa, we realize further technology development will be required. But also we think the technology needs to be fit for African farmers, especially on these points. 1, technology should be practicable by farmers. 2, technology should be beneficial for farmers. And 3, technology should utilize local materials for farmers. Today, I want to introduce our activities, fallow band system, farmers applicable conservation agriculture, and African local phosphate rock utilization. Next, please. I'll introduce you one of the technologies we developed. Fallow band system, FBS, is initially designed to control soil erosion by wind and increase crop production in Niger. It is a simple practice and does not require any additional cost or labor from local farmers. Click, please. It was selected as a promising countermeasure against wind erosion by FAO Global Soil Partnership. Next slide. This figure illustrates the outline of the FBS. In the rainy season, first year, herbaceous fallow bands are arranged in a cultivated field at a right angle to the direction of erosive wind, east wind here. The fallow bands can be easily created by skipping usual seeding and weeding. So by doing nothing, and thus additional cost or labor will not be imposed on the local farmers. The fallow bands are maintained in the next dry season so that they would trap the wind-blown materials containing many nutrients and control wind erosion. In the next rainy season, fallow bands will be shifted to the direction of the wind, and crops will be cultivated on the former fallow bands as well as in other areas of the field. Click, please. Because the larger amount of the nutrients is accumulated in the former fallow bands, we can expect improved crop production there. Next slide, please. 4-year on-station and on-farm trials show that FBS controlled wind erosion by over 70%, and FBS increased crop production by 36 to 81%. Effects on water erosion control and crop production are being evaluated in Burkina Faso. Next slide. The FBS was adopted by farmers in 89 villages, 23 districts, and 5 regions in 2010 to 2012. And follow-up survey showed that 74% of the farmers continued FBS in 2016. Next slide. JIRCAS has been conducted conservation agriculture research in West Africa. As you know, conservation agriculture consists of 3 principles. As shown in the photos as example, minimum tillage by reaper, residual mulch, and pigeon pea intercropping or array with main crop. We have conducted multi-location trials at 6 sites with similar protocol, and sloping field trials at 3 sites, from Sudan savanna to tropical rainforest, to evaluate the effect on crop yield and on soil and water conservation. Next slide. I'd like to show just a part of the result at Kumasi in Ghana, located in the tropical rainforest zone. For intercrop, one of CA principles, we used pigeon pea as a test plant. In 2013, since pigeon pea was still small and the treatment did not show a significant difference. However, in 2014 and 2015, pigeon pea intercropping for both 2 treatments was highly effective to increase the yield of maize, thanks to abundant leaf input to the soil by pruning. However, it required more labor for pruning to avoid competition. Next slide, please. Effect on soil and water conservation was studied in the sloping field. the results show minimum tillage plus residue mulch reduced soil erosion and water runoff, whether or not mucuna or pigeon pea intercropping is added. It means that minimum tillage plus residue mulch is enough to prevent soil erosion. Similar results were obtained in the tropical rainforest. As conclusion here, perennial pigeon pea intercropping or array is one of the promising CA components in the south from Guinea savanna zone. And soil and water conservation can be achieved by two principles: the combination of non or minimum tillage with residue mulch in the old zone. Next slide, please. And we are recently working for low-grade phosphate rock utilization in Africa. Africa has over 80% of the world's phosphate reserve, but its utilization rate is just 3%. Further, it is known that huge low-grade phosphate rocks are found in Africa. However, it is not fully utilized. So we are conducting a project which is aiming to utilize local phosphate rocks. The project is targeting to utilize local phosphate rocks in Burkina Faso. Next slide, please. To achieve local phosphate rock utilization, the following three types of pea fertilizer are examined. One is the phosphate rock powder. Phosphate rock is inexpensive, but its effects are not immediately apparent, reflecting its very low solubility. Please. Partially acidulated phosphate rock is a phosphate rock that is reacted with sulfuric acid. It has the advantage of being a water-soluble pea fertilizer and of being able to replenish sulfur. It has the risk of soil acidification. This method cannot remove heavy metals such as cadmium, which is often present in phosphate rocks. Click this. Calcinated phosphate rock is produced by adding various carbonates and calcinating at high temperatures. It is now possible to make phosphorus fertilizers with various properties depending on the type and mixing ratio of the carbonates added. The advantage includes the removal of heavy metals as well as no risk of causing soil acidification. Next slide, please. These slides show direct application effects of low-grade phosphate rocks on rain-fed lowland rice yield. Direct application of low-grade phosphate rock, PRDA, is expected to be effective in rice cultivation, but the cultivation environment of African rain-fed rice is diverse, and its application is not uniform. PRDA in the Sudan Savanna Zone, SS, Guinea Savanna Zone, GS, and Equatorial Forest Zone, EF, has different effects in the first year. And in addition, the residual effects are different. Even reducing the frequency twice every 3 years in SS and GS, and once every 3 years in EF, PRDA can obtain similar yield to annual applications. Next slide, please. Calcination with potassium or sodium carbonate can make soluble in citric acid to a maximum of 100% and water soluble to 38% of total P2O5. The application effect is comparable to TSP, a commercial pea fertilizer. In addition, calcination with potassium carbonate is expected to supply not only phosphorus, but also potassium and calcium. And as a slow-release alkaline fertilizer, it must be effective in tropical acidic soil. This calcination method can also be applied to the solubilization of other African low-grade phosphate rocks. We expected that the use of these different pea fertilizers will contribute to reduced fertilizer application and improvement in soil condition and yield. Next slide, please. From our experiences, we want to summarize as follows. Despite a good technology, it is useless if it is not practicable for farmers. we need to aim to develop practicable technologies like fallow band system. Although technical packages have a positive effect on soil health strengthening, it should contribute to the improvement of yield and our farmers' income to disseminate technology. And technology for soil health enhancement should utilize local materials, such as organic resources and local phosphate rocks, to reduce its cost and ensure applicability and accessibility. Next slide, please. This is my final slide. To achieve soil health enhancement, I think we should recognize we are facing an urgent need to change agricultural practice to strengthen sustainable productivity and restore soil health. And we need to consider technological development and extension method for smallholders that take into account local edapoclimatic and socioeconomic conditions. And we need to validate and develop practical, sustainable technologies based on scientific findings and train human resources for their deployment. And in addition, to achieve social scale impacts, the partnership among government, development, research, and extension sectors is essential. With these things in my mind, JIRCAS will continue the effort to improve the agricultural system for the future of Africa. That's all. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that very good presentation. Looking at this fallow band system in West Africa and how we can improve on our soils with the mantra that there's no one size that fits all. Now, we'll move to the panel discussion, and I'll hand over the chair to Dr. Miyuki Liyama, who is a program director for information program at JIRCAS. Dr. Miyumi spent 10 years in Africa, the World Agroforestry Center in Kenya, and she's been working on economic and environmental variability of natural resource management in smallholder systems in Africa. So Dr. Miyumi, please, I'll hand over the chairmanship to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mel. This is Miyuki Yama of JIRCAS. I feel very honored to chair this session to facilitate the discussion on how to contextualize regenerative agriculture as a means to achieve soil health, food security, and environmental sustainability in African smallholder settings. Today, we are privileged to have the distinguished panelists. All are representing organizations specialized in agriculture research, while their scopes vary from training, international coordination, development strategy, and extension. Please let me introduce them, okay? First, Dr. Kofi Boa of CNTA. Initially, Dr. Elias from Ethiopia was supposed to attend this session, but unfortunately, he is not available today due to his official commitment. So Dr. Boa accepted that he could join us. During the field research report session, he introduced his experience of dedicating himself to the realization of soil health through conservation agriculture training, farmers and students. We are privileged to hear more from him. And Dr. Edmundo Barrios is Agriculture Officer at FAO. He provides technical and policy-related advice on ecosystem management, soil health, and biodiversity that supports agroecological transition to sustainable food and agriculture systems. As a soil ecologist with more than 20 years of research for development experience with the CGIAR based in Latin America at SIA and Africa at ICRA, he investigated the linkages between soil health, biodiversity, and productivity in agriculture and agroforestry systems. And Dr. Kirahun Amede is in charge of resilience, climate, and soil fertility program at AGRA, where he develops and institutionalizes sustainable farming program, which ensures investment in both increasing agriculture productivity and environmental health, taking consideration of climate risks. Before joining AGRA, he was principal scientist at CGIAR, while also serving as a country representative for ICRISAT. And Dr. Sani Miko, He started his career as irrigation agronomist with focus on cereal agronomy and water management. He was also in academics as the head of the agronomy department and the dean of the Faculty of Agriculture at Bayero University. He has been country director of Sasakawa Africa Association Nigeria operation since 2009, engaged in research and extension. I hope now the audience are convinced that these panelists have indeed very relevant technical and on-ground experience to discuss today's topic. To take advantage of their presence, I try to frame discussion around the two big research questions. Then I will ask each of the panelists more specific questions depending on their expertise. Let me now raise the first big question. Promoting regenerative agriculture and environmental sustainability in Africa, how and why? Already, as keynote speakers and other speakers already mentioned, the centrality of healthy soil is obvious for food security and environmental sustainability in Africa. Regenerative agriculture indeed puts its focus to restore soil health and to reduce soil degradation. In turn, the effectiveness of specific soil management recommendations may need to be validated before being introduced, taking into consideration a very diverse local context. So before promoting specific management practices, we need to understand the nexus of soil health, food security, and environmental sustainability in African smallholder context. Let us hear from our distinguished panelists. First, Dr. Boa, could you tell us what had motivated you to establish the Center for No-Till Agriculture, CNTA, in Ghana? Could you tell us? Yes, could you tell us by elaborating your diagnosis of the trend and the state of soil health, food security, and environmental sustainability in African smallholder context? And given that, what kind of innovation in the name of regenerative agriculture should be most needed and promoted in Africa?
Thank you very much. It's very interesting that I have to talk about some of these things. Now, what actually motivated me to set up the Center for No-Till Agriculture, which is doing a lot of wonderful work here, is it came as a result of tragedy, as a result of passion, and as a result of commitment to help other people get to know what to do in terms of building soil health to improve food security. Now, I was a little boy, 10 years when my father died. And at age 12, I was just left at home with my mother. But my mother had a small cocoa farm, which was taking care of us. And cocoa is very important in Ghana. But one day, the cocoa, somebody went to clear a small portion by the cocoa farm, set fire to it to be able to grow maize. It went into the cocoa farm and destroyed the cocoa farm completely. So at age 12, I suffered, and even the primary school, I had to stop going to school because my mother could not support me. And so at that age, I said to my mother, I gave my mother a promise that I was going to spend my whole life to teach people to stop the use of fire on the farmland so that no child ever suffers like I did. And so at that age of 12, till now, today, I'm 67. I have committed myself to this cause. And today I can say for sure that I am at the top, showing it to people, doing it myself, and the results are there to show. So as I was doing this, coming from my promise to counter that tragedy, I became so passionate. I got to know what there is to do. I saw the value, the evidence, the benefits, and that passion continued. So I got motivated to uphold my commitment of showing several other people this is the way to do. And the best thing was to set up the center to offer knowledge and experience, to show people the benefits and the evidence and the processes. And that is how come I set up the Center for No-Till Agriculture. Now, talking about the trend and the state of soil health, food security, and environmental sustainability. Everybody realizes that the three are inseparable. You cannot separate one from the other, because the more and more we are able to improve soil health, we're getting more food to ensure food security. And whenever we are in good soil health production systems, the environment also benefits. But what we have seen across Africa is that earlier on, population was just too low, and nobody ever cared about soil health because people could just clear the land, farm for 1 year or two, and go away, and it was self-regenerating. And because of that, food security was not a problem, and the environment was not hurt. But as population started growing, and then we had several pressures of the increased population, that is where we began going down the drain as far as soil health is concerned. And so what has happened is that we have had a downward trend, and currently it's not good. The story is not good in several places. We're hearing about the Horn of Africa, what is happening. And so at this moment, this is where we are. Soil health, food security, environmental decimation, serious. And so it will be good for all of us to put ourselves together to ensure that we reverse this. Now, this is where this is the tricky part. Regenerative agriculture. We have listened to the keynote addresses. We have listened to presentations, and everybody agrees that it is a way to go. No doubt about that. I have been in this business, but my problem with the system is that it's not just about now what I want to say is that there is so much that we know already as to conservation agri practices, together with good agricultural practices of ensuring that we manage the soil nutrition so well. We do all other things, timely planting, good seed, planting at the right density. But there is one thing that we are missing on, and that is where I want to talk a little bit. You see, those of us in the regenerative movement, we have taken a stand. And all we are saying is either this or no, and which is very, very bad for us. Because what we have to realize is that regenerative agriculture in several instances is new. Our target, the smallholder farmers, are very much risk averse, and therefore we have to transition them to a point where they become so confident. Our dogmatic stand of saying no to several other things is what is killing us. And so, for instance, if within the system right now in my home, there is acute shortage of labor, all the youth are engaged in mining. And so the elderly people that are left at home with the least strength cannot support it. So in a situation like this, there's got to be the infusion of a little bit of external input, like so to say, at least a herbicide for pre-planting, such that farmers are able to prepare the land and plant. Without that, they will not be able to move. And if they are not able to plant anything, they will die out of hunger. So what I'm saying is that dogmatism should give way to flexibility to such an extent that we are able to accommodate certain things that need to be brought in till we stabilize. That is the area where I need to see a lot of action, rather than taking a stand that we have to understand that regenerative agriculture is not equal to conservation, organic agriculture. But what I have realized on my farm over the years is that when you go deep into regenerative agriculture, you build a system which then makes it such that you reduce your external input. And the external input is basically these inorganic products. So naturally, the system will allow for the reduction, drastic reduction of external inputs. But in the beginning, we don't have to be that much dogmatic. There's got to be several innovations in there which will allow flexibility. So, and the underlying thing is dogmatism should give way to flexibility.
Thank you so much. It's a really amazing story. And actually your life history is really amazing. You turned your own tragedy into miracle, and then also like supporting the commitment to support your society and community. That is really amazing. And another story is like, yes, considering the risks and then resource constraints of farmers, the regenerative agriculture should be flexible, not falling into dogmatism. That is your message.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Now, I would like to ask Dr. Barrios. Okay, you have had rich experience as a soil scientist working with smallholder farmers, not only in Africa, but also in Latin America. You have also been engaged with various stakeholders at FAO discussing promising transition to sustainable agriculture. How do you view and expect regenerative agriculture as a potential solution to address soil health, food security, and environmental sustainability nexus in African smallholder context?
Thank you very much, Ms. Iyama. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all, wherever you are. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to be part of this interesting panel discussion. Next slide, please. No, the previous one. Yes. As noted by several speakers, there is a great concern that the global food system is not delivering as needed on several key sustainable development indicators. This global trend is also strongly reflected in Africa. The consensus on the urgent need for a global transition to agriculture and food systems that ensure food nutrition and security for all, while reversing environmental degradation and adapting to climate change, was ratified at the UN Food Systems Summit last year. It was also recognized that tackling such sustainability transitions requires a long-term perspective and holistic approaches of the kind embodied by agroecology, because systemic challenges need to be faced with systemic responses. A coalition for food systems transformation through agroecology was another prominent outcome of the UN Food Systems Summit. Since 2014, FAO has opened a neutral space of intersectoral and multi-stakeholder dialogue on agroecology to consolidate evidence and to understand key principles and conditions to bring it to scale. Next, please. Recognizing that inherent complexity of sustainability transitions can be a deterrent to action, the 194 member countries of FAO approved the 10 elements of agroecology as an analytical framework to guide the design of differentiated paths for agriculture and food systems transformation. By providing a simplified yet holistic version of reality, the 10 elements framework can facilitate improved decision-making by farmers, practitioners, policymakers, and other stakeholders in different contexts at a range of levels on a number of scales. Next, please. Briefly, the framework considers the elements diversity and co-creation and sharing of knowledge as foundational characteristics of agroecological systems that help to guide diversification choices aimed at creating synergies and minimizing trade-offs. Next, please. The elements efficiency and resilience are emerging properties of systems built upon the above 3 elements, and where recycling is a central agroecological practice. Next. The elements human and social values and culture and food traditions describe context features of agroecological systems. Next. The elements responsible governance and circular and solidarity economy describe the enabling environment as well as serving as aspirational goals. As we can see, the 10 elements are interlinked and interdependent. Each element is essential, reflecting the holistic and integrated nature of agroecology. Diversification of agricultural systems for enhanced soil health, food security, and environmental sustainability should be guided by co-creation and sharing of knowledge. The central role of ecological processes and social interactions in agricultural systems means that adaptation to local environmental and social conditions is critical in the innovation process, bringing into focus, of course, the important local knowledge of smallholder producers. These interactions also highlight the need for continuous research on options for a wide range of contexts to respond to changing social environmental conditions. In this way, proven local practices combined with scientific knowledge can provide relevant guidance on what crops, livestock, and trees to include on the farm, where to place them, and how to manage them to promote healthy soils and land productivity. The 10 elements of agroecology apply to all forms of sustainable agriculture and food production, including regenerative agriculture, conservation agriculture, climate-smart agriculture, agroforestry, and crop, livestock, and pastoral systems. Therefore, the 10 elements can provide useful guidance for ecological intensification decisions and actions to face the soil health, food security, environmental sustainability nexus challenges under smallholder farming systems in Africa. Back to you, Chair, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barrios, for sharing the experience from agroecological approach. It's very informative. Now I'm going to ask Dr. Amede. Okay, Dr. Amede, in Africa, in many cases, farm productivity is low due to low soil fertility, low fertilizer application, and low availability of organic matters. Practically, what do you think is needed to transform poor nutrient soil into regenerative one in African smallholder context? How can regenerative agriculture prove itself not only to reverse soil mining, but also to sustain improved land labor productivity for food security?
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I don't know what has not been said. Excellent presentations from the previous speakers. I would start to say, yes.
Could you make the slide presentation mode?
All right.
Yeah, thank you. And then 4 minutes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, that's always my challenge. Do you see it in a slide, the presentation mode?
It's very difficult, but you can go ahead.
Okay, let me enlarge it. If I can enlarge it, would that be better? Yeah, I will talk about it. Let me talk about it. So what I'm saying is, you know, a lot of knowledge. Everybody's experimenting on regenerative agriculture. In some countries, it became an ideology. In others, dogmatism, as it was said by my colleagues, previous speakers. But you know, at the end of the day, what does it mean for Africa is, I think, the issue. For us, you know, it's beyond the environment. And I'm suggesting here a definition from my institute's perspective, the Alliance for Green Innovation in Africa, AGRA. So we treat it as an approach to farming that focuses on restoring degraded farms and landscapes, so really farms and landscapes, concomitantly increasing productivity and enhancing resilience through context-specific and integrated farming techniques that mimic the natural ecosystem. So what it means is that, you know, there are immediate needs, which is food security, that farmers have to have incentives for them to adapt them. The technology and practice that has been listed by my previous speakers are there. But the issue is, you know, when we talk about productivity and livelihoods, the soil alone will not give you the benefits. So we have to bring in a responsive, resilient systems, seeds, varieties, management practices. But also these practices are knowledge intensive. So they are not really seeds or fertilizer you can say in 100 kilometers by a train or by, you know, a truck. It should be accompanied by knowledge on how to do, on how to combine, on how to bring the pieces together. And that is what we call last mile delivery system, a functional extension system that will really facilitate adoption of farmers. And you know, we have been experimenting with it in the continent in a different format. So for us, regenerative agriculture is not a new concept. African farmers have been having it in their home gardens, in patches. You could see here two slides, two pictures, one very green, one still struggling. In the same farm, in the same farmer's field, a plant called insect in Ethiopia, 3 years old, 50 meters from each other. This one is about 3 to 4 meters high, green, beautiful, This one is still 0.5 meter. All the residues, mulches, the livestock feed, which is converted to manure and added here in the homestead, was coming from this outfield. So Professor Giller has been talking about it. So that move has been enriching one plot at the expense of the other. And when we measured the soil carbon, it's more than double. Farmers have incentives to apply it here because it is a place where they have the coffee, the high value crops, the seedlings, and they keep doing that, but at the expense of that. So what do we do in the outfield if we want to expand this field into, or the regenerative practice into the other fields? So there are investments required. Nutrients are required. Liming is required. All the mechanization is required to stop erosion. So all sorts of other investments should come in if we want to bring in conservation and regenerative agriculture into practice. If we do that well, this is a mountainous area in the Ethiopian highlands. In 6 years' time, we have communities built soil and water conservation, benches, stored water, brought in varieties with researchers. In 6 years' time, you could see yield and food security in the intervention areas was much more advanced. Only less than 20% of the people were talking about lack of food at the peak seasons compared to the conventional controlled areas. So what it means is conservation agriculture should be done at a scale. It should combine multiple interventions. The interventions have to reach to farmers, and these farmers have to have the access to market and to the incentives. And that leads me to the last slide, whereby you see, really, when you ask farmers what has changed in the system, they tell you that about 50% of them, 52%, were saying this yield enhancement was coming from the sustainable land water management practices, while in the conventional areas, they are saying, something has changed, probably the weather. So they were not even aware of what has changed because they're not getting the benefits. And resilient seed was a major component, which expresses itself when the soil is good, when the water is conserved, and when the risk is minimized. So for us, the combination of these practices along with appropriate niches, appropriate resilient varieties, and an extension system that reaches farmers is the way forward for the African continent. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Chirafun, to show the evidence of resilience and food security by regenerative agriculture management practices, but it needs investment and then locally tailored extension services. Now I'm going to ask Dr. Misko. Sasakawa Africa Association is known for its decade of commitment to working with farmers, as its slogan claims. Can you share your view if farmers are ready to adopt regenerative agriculture practices, or if they are facing challenges, what are they? Please keep your time, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to thank all those beautiful presentations. As an extension organization, our major entry point into communities is to engage the farmers to discuss their problems first, understand what challenges they are facing, and then with them we design solutions to their problems. And when you talk of regenerative agriculture, Sasakawa has discovered over the years that farmers are fully aware of the decline in productivity of their soils, and therefore they are looking for a means and ways to restore the fertility status of their soils. Farmers are also equally aware of the challenging climate changes that are becoming glaring to them, but only a few of them fully understood the effects of climate change on their farming activities. We've also discovered that farmers are increasingly becoming aware of the very, very costly investment they make in chemical fertilizers, and they're also battling with availability and adulteration problems. And some of the farmers have a belief that the chemical fertilizers actually destroy their soils. But like we heard from Ken and Lal, addition of chemical fertilizers alone cannot increase yield if the soil structure is not really improved often. So farmers are very, very happy and they are willing to adapt the regenerative agriculture technologies we are promoting to them, especially when they see the immediate changes on their crops and also with the current scenario in terms of the cost of fertilizer in the global market now. Now, when you talk of the challenges farmers face, what we discovered is that traditionally, it is very difficult for farmers to work away from a history of practices that have been handed down to them over generations. There's a lot of mindset of how to move away from such traditional practices. There is also a problem of lack of clarity. We have heard this morning that there is no consistency in how the term regenerative agriculture is used. So farmers often are not very sure what exactly is regenerative agriculture. We also battle with farmers that have long-standing relationships with agricultural consultants in the old model that are relying on chemical inputs. So this is a big challenge in most of the communities we work. And we also discovered that farmers are very much concerned about their families. They have families to feed and they have bills to pay, and they have fear of reduction in terms of their productivity or production as they transition from the current conventional system into the regenerative agriculture. And we have difficulty in getting support coming from public institutions. And what we also discovered is farmers find it difficult to produce greens, for instance, in green manuring, and plow these greens under the soil just to increase soil fertility. So there is therefore a huge competition between consumption and soil fertility maintenance strategy. Farmers also, we discovered, seldom incorporate crop residues, especially the stalks and the chaffs from the harvested fields, to increase decomposable organics into the soil. Rather, they use these as sources of fuel and incomes. A lot of them, they rely on selling these crop residues to generate income. And the volume of organics that we need to create the immediate impact on soils in terms of productivity is another big challenge for farmers. They don't have enough of these organics around them. And also, we discovered the impact of regenerative technologies is not really an immediate impact. It takes a little time for the farmers to realize and start seeing visibly the benefits of the addition of organics into their field. There is also the need to help farmers in terms of getting alternative energy sources, because they use these byproducts from the farm as sources of energy, and they hardly bring it back into the soil. As Lal said, whatever is taken out of the soil should be returned back. And so what farmers do, they remove everything, the grains and the stock out of the soil. So what we really require as an alternative to this kind of issue is to address the issue of disconnect between the wider social and ecological values of regenerative agriculture, which we have already attested to them physically, with the likelihood of immediate short-term decreases in yield, which will directly impact already marginalized farmers as we find them around Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, Dr. Miko already mentioned many critical needs of farmers. Actually, that would be making up of the second big question. Because in order to achieve social scale impact of food security and environmental sustainability, there should be a modality for research, development, and policy collaboration in place to facilitate farmers to adapt good management practices, which are then to be scaled up and out. So, Dr. Miko, you already mentioned, so could you briefly summarize what kind of, how should farmers be an extension system be supported technically, financially, and by policy? Maybe 1-2 minutes, please.
Yeah,
Could you
thank
just
you.
summarize? Yes.
Thank you very much. What we feel as an extension organization is there is need for us to engage in wider and effective sensitization of smallholder farmers on climate change and its impact on agriculture generally, and on the need to reinvigorate their soils through deploying some of these technologies. Farmers should also be supported in terms of rigorous training on regenerative agriculture concepts and practices and their long-run effect on their soils. We should also try to develop and promote training manuals such as handbooks, leaflets, to widen the awareness and skills and knowledge of the smallholder farmers. We are also supposed to work hand in hand with research so that we can source, adapt, and promote relevant equipment and technologies so that farmers can have access to these technologies to continue to deploy them in their field. We should also build an open access knowledge store of validated regenerative agriculture resources and connect this to farmers so that they can have wider access to these technologies, and make sure these technologies are not one-fit-all system. They must be matched with the situations that we find farmers in. We should also widen the scope of regenerative agriculture demonstration farms and also make farmers as the center of these technologies so that they own it up, they learn it, and also adapt it in their system. We should also try to mainstream regenerative agriculture as a new pathway to livelihood prosperity by raising public awareness and support. To this end, we are calling for a concerted effort towards partnership. The public research system, the international donor agencies, the private sector, extension, all should come into a holistic agreement and design a holistic system that can address farmers' requirements towards deploying some of these regenerative technologies to the smallholder farmers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miko. Now, Dr. Barrios, could you briefly suggest how science communities can support and complement farmers' approach, farmers' initiative? Just 1 minute, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. The difficulty of transforming agriculture and food systems in a way that responds to both local and national expectations and desires, as well as global commitments, is a major constraint to transformative change. While the consensus call for transformative change has been emphasized, as discussed by many of the previous presenters, and also in several recent global assessments and FAO reports, there is less agreement on how this could be accomplished. FAO is distinctive in having both the mandate and the convening capacity to bring relevant stakeholders together to design, develop, and implement impactful initiatives through coordinated and collective action. In this sense, FAO has a key role to play, providing information and sharing knowledge and experiences among countries on the range of existing and emerging innovations. The 10 elements framework highlights 4 promising entry points, namely biodiversity, consumers, education, and governance, to build a structured process that concisely links all the 10 elements to the stepwise design of prospective agroecological transitions. Nexus approaches are used to highlight and examine salient interactions among different sectors and entry points prior to developing visual narratives to describe plausible theories of transformative change towards sustainable agriculture and food systems. For example, the biodiversity, nutrition, climate change nexus highlights that diversification is central to facing climate change as well as nutrition challenges. This is because variations in agricultural use and management of plant and animal diversity can have important impacts on the adaptive capacity of agricultural systems to climate change, as well as on their contribution to healthy diets. Increased tree cover in agricultural lands through agroforestry practices adapted to context represents a concrete example with great contributing to more diversified and nutritious diets. Second, the tool for agroecology performance evaluation, also known as TAPE, has been developed by FAO and collaborators and applied to date in more than 30 countries to assess productivity and other agroecosystem performance indicators. TAPE uses a set of metrics and protocols to evaluate the multidimensional contribution of agroecology and other approaches to transformation of agriculture and food systems, including social, economic, and environmental performance indicators, such as income, dietary diversity, women's empowerment, youth employment, agricultural biodiversity, and soil health. Finally, FAO has also an important role in ensuring that the uptake of innovation and technology is adapted to local needs and contexts. The African Family Farming and Agroecology Community of Practice, for example, has recently organized a 4-week virtual dialogue entitled The Co-Creation, Sharing, and Dissemination of Local Innovations for Healthy Soils in Africa, which involved close to 200 participants. In the short time available, I hope these 3 examples illustrated well different avenues by which the Scaling Up Agroecology Initiative hosted at FAO is contributing to transformative change, supporting transitions to sustainable agriculture and food systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Amede, farmers may be resource constrained. So to introduce good practices, what financial and technical support the private sector and the development sector should provide? Could you comment in 1 minute? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I want to give you a practical example. AGRA is experimenting this approach in 3 countries in Africa, in Kenya, in Nigeria, and in Burkina Faso, and different names. And what we learned is that, I think the first thing is farmers need to be profitable to adapt it. So there should be an increment in yield, contribution to livelihoods. Of course, also, minimize the risk of crop failure, so really increase their resilience. And that requires a context-specific investment framework. What it means is, one, should be market-driven, where possible, in a sequenced approach. So probably our entry points and niches are usually in high-value crops, in fruit trees, in spices, in vegetables, before moving to really cereals. So that is one. The second thing we learned is that the type of interventions, practices are context specific. What is good in the Sahel is not good in the Ethiopian highlands or in Rwandan highlands. So we need to follow a farming system approach, which is context specific, that bring about benefits. The other thing I just wanted to repeat myself is really a need for a specialized extension, beyond a conventional input-oriented extension with appropriate extension context, which brings really different solutions together. And we in AGRA are experimenting, again, working with, what we call village-based advisories, because as you know, in the continent, the extension to farmer ratio is very high. There are few extensions on the ground trained. And it's even more challenging for this type of knowledge-intensive practices. So really having that specialized extension support is required. And the private sector, of course, is critical in all of these, be it in improving the input-output market linkages, in adding value to those, but also making sure that there's a reliable and profitable approach, so that farmers continue producing those while really they are recovering and restoring their lands and landscapes. That, of course, should be accompanied by incentives for adoption. So, globally, At least in the West, people talk about carbon credits, carbon markets, voluntary markets, RA certification, all that, organic agriculture, labeling, all that should come in and be accompanied, by these practices. So technology push is not only, is not going to work alone. And this cannot be done again by one institution, not by one government. We need that network of actors, be it the private sector, governments, research institutions, to address the gaps in knowledge, in input, in markets, across the value chain. And that is really where sustainability comes in. At the end of the day, of course, it is a community, which is going to adapt. It's not Sasakawa, it's not Agra. The communities are the ones who are deciding what is going to be adopted or rejected. So that requires, of course, a policy engagement at national, at county level, at district level, to promote it, to make it work, and to institutionalize it at a scale. Thank you.
So much. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Amede. Finally, Dr. Boa, as already the panelists already stating how African stakeholders should commit themselves to working together to promote investment in capacity building of farmers to realize healthy soil for food security and environmental sustainability. Do you make a brief comment in 1-2 minutes? Thank you.
Yeah, just about a minute. You see, a lot of things on my head have already been said, but you see, my biggest problem has to do who is the stakeholder. I mean, when we begin to categorize people into researchers, extensionists, policymakers, donors, this is where we get it all wrong. Because this particular problem is the problem of everybody in Africa. So in order not to say the stakeholders, the donors, and these people are not regrouping, they are not researchers, are not doing, I say, we should take it out and say consumer, because everybody who lives in a day from morning to evening in Africa consumes food, eats food. And so what I want to see is that all of us in Africa, irrespective of whatever you do, you are a consumer, and the very moment you're a consumer of food, the soil health problem is your problem, food security is your problem, environmental sustainability is your problem. And so all of us consumers realizing this have to come together to think alike and to act collectively in such a way that we are able to address our own problem. The problem is our own problem and the solution is our own solution. But then, as it has kept resounding, my take in this is that we have to do whatever we have to do in terms of amassing resources, both physical and time, to address the issue in the context of the recommendation domain, so that we can take care of the specificities of local conditions. Otherwise, the way we're doing it, it will just be like at the global level, and we're not narrowing down to the specific conditions within the varied conditions in Africa. And so for me, just to say this is that I would expect that we all come together to commit ourselves to solving our own problems created by our own self in the context of specific recommendation domain to take care of the specificities of local conditions.
Thank you so much. Actually, Dr. Boa is summarizing what we are talking about. The practice of regenerative agriculture must be locally specific, locally tailored. But the soil health, food security, and the environmental sustainability is everybody's issues. Not we are grouping stakeholders. Everybody has to take charge of this. Thank you so much. Maybe that is all from this panel session. Thank you so much for the panelists. And I'm going to give the floor back to Dr. Mel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miyuki, for guiding this important panel discussion, which has brought out some key issues which we need to think over and see how we can integrate and incorporate all this into our farming systems so that we may be able to rebuild our soils through regenerative agriculture approaches. We are now coming to the final end, of our event. We are a little bit behind time, actually. And now we are going to cut short, we're moving to question and answer, but we'll ask probably only 2 questions. So we'll pick from the chat box what has been asked and what was previously asked, before. And I would like to start with a question to Ken Gila. It is not clear that agroecology, which can be compatible with efficiency and productivity improvement and environmental protection for small-scale farmers, is also effective in large-scale production. Could you kindly tell us how we should think about the relationship between global food security, large-scale production, and the promotion of agroecology? I know you touched a little bit about it already.
I think, Mel, I mean, thank you so much. And thank you, Miho, for such a question that it's impossible to answer in the 30 seconds that's available. I mean, I think you get to the heart of the problem, though. And I think the issue when we look at the global level is we have to be face up to the fact that there are going to be another 3 billion people in the world by the end of the century. And many of them in Africa, that the African population's rising enormously quickly. I think the principles of agroecology make a lot of sense everywhere, but that doesn't mean that we can do away with large farms and intensive production in places where that's suitable, where these huge farms in Africa, in Australia, in areas where very few people live, but still produce very large amounts of wheat for the world's population. And I think where they increasingly strive also to produce food very efficiently. So I think it's a matter that these principles can be guiding principles for us to design our systems. But in my mind, we have to be careful not to try and impose them in a dogmatic or ideological way, because I think the fundamental issue of how we're going to feed everybody and preserve our soils and the environment is an absolutely critical one. And maybe that's one that we need to spend another few hours debating at the next webinar, Mel. So I put an answer in the chat with a bit of reading there, which I hope will help. And I'd be happy to engage with people in future on the topic. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Ken, for that quick and brief response to that. And indeed, there's another webinar coming where we hope we'll engage you further to be able to help us unravel all this myth and what is going on in agroecology and regenerative agriculture. Yeah, we'll quickly move to the next question, which is addressed to Dr. Ratan Lal. I'm not sure if Ratan Lal is still with us. He's not with us at this particular moment.
No, I'm with you.
Oh, I'm sorry. There you are. Yeah. Okay. There's a question which is directed to you, and we believe regenerative agriculture in Africa can be promoted in connection with a program to create carbon credits. We'd really appreciate your current assessment and opinion on this matter.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very relevant question. We are demanding from farmers to generate ecosystem services which serve the global community and the planet through regenerative agriculture, through agroecology, through transforming low productivity agriculture to high productivity, to address climate change, water quality, biodiversity, landscape restoration, demanding from poor farmers and then say, do it for us. And we do not want to pay you anything. That will never happen. Unless society, consumer, you, me, policymaker, everybody is willing to pay farmer for what we are asking them to do, we have no right to ask them. So for them to provide these services we are demanding, they should be paid fairly, justly, properly, adequately. Carbon sequestration, $130 a ton, $35 a credit. And the question, can you monitor? Can you verify? Those are simply bottlenecks. In the US, we had a CRP system. It was adopted on 40 million acres Farm Bill of 1987. Farmers were told, take out the erodible land, do not plow, do not cultivate, we'll pay you as much as you would have got by growing corn and soybean. It happened. But we were not monitoring on every acre what was runoff and erosion. Why are we making those excuses now? We know the rate of carbon sequestration on experimental plots for key location, pay them. And the service cost should not be 90% going to people who are arranging the payment. 90% of the total price should go to farmers. That's very important. Pay fairly, pay justly, pay transparently, and make sure that they are respected. Respectful, proper payment. This is not a donation. It's not a charity. It's not a handout. It's a service being demanded from them. Pay for it.
Thank you very much, Professor Lal, for that insightful response, which is really important. We should not just take farmers for granted, and that's one of the biggest mistakes we always make. They should be paid for some of their services so that they can earn from their sweat. And we really appreciate your coming to be able to address some of these important issues for us. We would have continued with a few questions which we had lined up, but because of lack of time, presenters, you just forgive us. We had a question for Lee and a few others, but you just forgive us because of lack of time. We already a little bit behind our allocated time for this particular event. And we'd like to close this event through concluding remarks, and we'd like to invite Dr. Makoto Kitanaka, who is the president of Sasakawa Africa Association, to give us the concluding remarks. Dr. Kitanaka, please.
Thank you to all our speakers, panelists, and to those of you participating online for joining us today. Today, we had over 500 people registered from all over the world for this side event, which is reflecting very high level of interest in the topic today. Indeed, we recognize that the soil health in Africa is one of the most important issues for the sustainable development of agriculture in Africa, and it is an issue that we must take action to resolve immediately. The environment surrounding agriculture in Africa has always been challenging due to its diversity in climate and ecosystem, soil degradation, effect of climate change, and it has become even more complicated due to the difficulties in grain import and soaring fertilizer and the fuel prices caused by the crisis in Ukraine. Furthermore, with population growth expected to continue on the African continent, agriculture and food security will become an even more important theme for all of us. In order to maintain sustainable and resilient agriculture production, it is essential to improve the soil, which is the foundation of healthy crop production. However, the soils of the African continent are geologically old, and soil management methods developed in developed countries cannot be just applied without proper customization suited to the conditions of that particular area in terms of agroecology, climate, and even socio-economic conditions. When it comes to fertilizer input, whether it is organic or inorganic, surely it has been increased much more in Africa, I hear that the international conference on fertilizer and soil health in Africa will be held next year, and I look forward to further discussions involving all stakeholders. Since last year, SAA Sasakawa Africa Association has been exploring the possibilities of regenerative agriculture in Africa as a means to sustainably improve soil health. We have been basic practice at the field level in our focus countries, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Mali, Nigeria. Besides on today's discussions, we'd like to accelerate our effort in defining and establishing programmatic approaches for generative agriculture in Africa. The important points here are that first, we cannot compromise food security for people in Africa, and secondly, order-made prescription is needed, as soil conditions and agro system vary even within Africa countries from region to region and from individual farmers' field to farmers' field. SAA and JIRCAS, which are organizing today's side event, is now working together to launch a research project in regenerative agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa next year with support from the Nippon Foundation. We hope that researchers and practitioners from Japan and abroad who share the same concern on soil health in Africa will join us. SAA, as a Japanese NGO working for more than 35 years in Africa, we are committed working with the farmer in Africa and connecting you to take on these big challenges. Thank you very much again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kitanaka, for those concluding remarks. And I'd like to remind all participants that due to time constraints, we could not cover all the submitted questions. We will compile them all together and have the panelists and presenters answer some of them, and we'll make all this available together and publish on the side event website. So we'd like to ask all the event presenters, keynote address presenters and panelists just to show their faces for a quick video, so that we can have that captured real quick before we close this event, so all the presenters and the panelists. Okay, we have that well captured. So thank you very much for all the participants, the presenters, and the panelists for taking your time to be able to participate in this event and to share with us all your insights, which have been incredibly informative. And we look forward to taking some of these concrete evidences that you've given to us and turn them into concrete actions in the field that can benefit African farmers. So thank you for your continued support, and we're looking forward to seeing you again, hopefully in 3 weeks, where we'll have additional side events during the TICAD, one on multidimensional digitally enabled agriculture extension in Africa, and another one on managing African soil for food security and environmental sustainability by looking at the opportunities and challenges of agronomy to solve low fertility and nutrient bottlenecks. And that will also be organized by JIRCAS, and the other one by SAA, IFPRI, and ALPHA. So thank you very much, and we wish you a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good evening. Bye.